The wind howled over the sacred mountaintop, stirring the dust in frantic spirals. At the heart of the storm stood Coatlicue, her hands rough from endless labor, her back bent beneath the weight of the world she carried. Her eyes, dark and watchful, held the gaze of the sun itself. She was a mother of gods, yet she worked alone, sweeping the temple with quiet reverence. The faint scent of blood and burning incense lingered in the air, as if the mountain remembered every offering ever made to it. As Coatlicue's broom dragged across the cold stone, something happened that should not have. A tuft of feathers, bright as fire and impossibly light, tumbled from the heavens and settled on the floor. It glowed faintly, flickering like a heartbeat, as though it carried a secret not meant for mortal eyes. Coatlicue bent to pick it up, pressing the soft plumage against her chest. In that moment, the feather became part of her, sinking beneath her skin without a word or sign. There was no pain, only warmth. She stood there for a long while, her breath steady but her pulse quickened. She knew. Somewhere inside her, life had taken root. When her children learned of this strange conception, they did not speak. They stared at their mother with eyes sharp and cold, filled with suspicion. Among them was Coatlicue, the moon herself, her silvered light trembling with something darker. Jealousy, perhaps. Or fear. Whispers spread like wildfire. Coatlicue had shamed them, they said. There was no father, no divine embrace. Only a feather, and now, she carried a child destined to rise above them all. Coatlicue's voice rose louder than the others, as smooth as silk but edged with venom. She called her brothers together, the Sense and Huitznawa, 400 stars whose glimmering weapons reflected their cold hearts. They could not allow this child to live. Night fell, and with it, the weight of betrayal. Coatlicue felt it before they came. The earth trembled beneath her feet, and in the quiet dark of the temple, she placed her hands on her swollen belly. She could hear him, her son. His heartbeat was fierce, strong enough to shake the heavens. They come, he whispered, though his lips had not yet touched the air of this world. Coatlicue closed her eyes, bracing for what she knew was inevitable. Coatlicue led the charge, her spear gleaming with the pale glow of the moon. Behind her, the stars moved as one, their shadows long and sharp. The temple steps stretched before them like the spine of a sleeping beast, waiting to be conquered. End this, Coatlicue called to her brothers, raising her blade to the heavens. She must fall. The child must not see the light. But the child had already seen more than they realized. From the womb, Huitzilopochtli listened. He listened to their footsteps, to the scrape of metal against stone. He listened to the hiss of Coatlicue's breath as she prepared to strike. I am ready, he told his mother, and his voice filled her veins with fire. In a burst of golden light, he was born, not as a helpless infant, but as a warrior fully armed, a shield in one hand and a burning serpent of fire in the other. His body gleamed like the midday sun, and his eyes carried the weight of the cosmos. The first sound to pierce the night was the cry of the serpent. Huitzilopochtli's weapon coiled and lashed forward, faster than any star, striking Coatlicue before she could lower her spear. The goddess gasped, staggering as the blow severed her from the ground itself. Her body twisted, heavy with the pull of gravity, and she tumbled down the temple steps, shattering into pieces with every fall. Still, Huitzilopochtli did not stop. His brothers rushed forward, but their strength was nothing against the blinding fire of the newborn god. One by one, the stars fell from the sky, their light snuffed out as Huitzilopochtli's blade found them in the dark. The battle raged until the first breath of dawn crept across the horizon. When it ended, Huitzilopochtli stood alone, his heart burning like the core of the sun. Coatlicue's body lay scattered at the foot of the temple, her head severed and lifeless. Her brothers lay beside her, nothing more than echoes in the dust. As the light grew, Huitzilopochtli climbed the steps, each footstep a promise that he would rise with the sun, that he would guard his people from the darkness that lurked beyond the edges of the world. Coatlicue watched him ascend, her eyes heavy but filled with quiet pride. The temple, now baptized in the blood of gods, stood silent beneath the morning sky. Yet the stars would return. The moon would rise again, watching with hollow eyes as Huitzilopochtli climbed the heavens each day, his war never truly over. Every sunrise carried the memory of that battle, the hum of feathers brushing against stone, the clash of fire against silver. And so, the world continued to turn, locked in an eternal dance between light and shadow. The sky was dark, but not because the sun had set. Something else hung over the world, a weight, a presence that whispered of betrayal before it even took form. In the stillness of the mountaintop, Coatlicue stood alone, her hands pressed against the cold stone of the temple. The wind tugged at her serpent skirt, but she did not move. She could feel them, her children, watching from the shadows. They were not far. They never were. Coatlicue stood at the front of them, silver light rippling through her hair, her eyes unreadable pools of night. Behind her, the Huitznawas shifted restlessly, their shapes flickering like stars that could not decide whether to shine or fade. 400 brothers, each a thread in the fabric of the sky, bound together in one unbroken constellation. But now, those stars turned inward, their light burning with resentment. Coatlicue's gaze lingered on Coatlicue. There was a time when she would have brushed the moon goddess's hair, weaving silver strands through her fingers while humming old songs neither of them remembered the words to. There was a time Coatlicue would have laughed, leaning against her mother's shoulder, careless and free. But gods are not allowed such luxuries for long. Now, the space between them stretched wide and thin, fragile as glass. How long have you known? Coatlicue's voice was soft, but the edge beneath it cut deeper than any blade. Coatlicue did not answer. The weight of the feather still lingered against her chest, even though it had long since disappeared. Her silence spoke louder than words ever could. Coatlicue's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. She took a step forward, and the stars followed, their footsteps quiet but heavy with meaning. You betray us. Coatlicue's whisper carried far, wrapping around the temple and sinking into its stones. The words fell like a stone into still water, rippling through the ranks of her brothers. Their hands clenched around the hilts of their weapons, though they did not yet raise them. Not yet. Coatlicue's hand hovered protectively over her stomach, where life stirred quietly beneath her skin. He could hear them, she knew he could. Even in the womb, Huitzilopochtli listened to the world with the ears of a warrior. Is that what you believe? Coatlicue asked softly. Coatlicue's gaze narrowed, her breath slow and measured, as if she were holding something inside, something dangerous, waiting to be set free. He will destroy us. Coatlicue's heart ached at the certainty in her daughter's voice. The moon never doubted the tides, nor the rise and fall of the night. She believed it as surely as she believed in her own light. But the stars around her flickered with hesitation. Some of the Huitznawas shifted, glancing at each other as if uncertain. They were not Coatlicue. They were many, but none as brilliant as the moon that guided them. Coatlicue's hand trembled against the stone. She did not know if she could save them. Coatlicue stepped closer, her silver cloak trailing behind her like falling stardust. You have chosen him over us, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the truth, and both of them knew it. But love is a strange thing. Coatlicue had loved Coatlicue once, and she loved the stars as a mother loves all her children. Yet, the love she carried now, this fierce, protective love for the child inside her, was different. It burned hotter, brighter. Coatlicue saw it in her mother's eyes, and she could not forgive it. The stars whispered behind her, restless as they shifted from foot to foot. One of the brothers, the tallest of them, spoke softly. Sister, is this necessary? Coatlicue's gaze snapped to him, and the star fell silent, shrinking beneath her glare. The weight of the moon's authority pressed against them all. Coatlicue watched them carefully. There was still a chance. A thin thread of hesitation lingered between them, fragile but unbroken. But Huitzilopochtli stirred again, and with him, so did the fire that Coatlicue could barely contain. I am ready, he whispered, his voice echoing through her veins. Coatlicue froze, her eyes narrowing as though she had heard him too. For a brief moment, everything stopped, the wind, the stars, the breath in Coatlicque's lungs. Quetzalcoatl's hand hovered over the hilt of her weapon, and in her eyes, something flickered. A choice. But the choice was not hers to make. The wind shifted. Coatlicque glanced at the sky and saw the clouds part, just enough to let the first sliver of sunlight through. It struck the temple steps, golden and warm, and she knew. The child inside her would rise. Quetzalcoatl's grip tightened around her spear. The hesitation was gone, burned away by the fire in her heart. "It ends tonight," she whispered, and the stars followed her lead. The moon never forgets. Even as the stars blink and fade, even as the sun scorches the sky, the moon lingers, watching, waiting. Quetzalcoatl's silver light stretched thin across the mountaintop, but it did not waver. Not yet. The night was heavy, pressing down like an unseen hand. The Sensen Huitznawa stood behind her, 400 stars shimmering faintly, though their brilliance felt distant, almost cold. Their weapons hummed in the stillness, sharp edges catching slivers of moonlight. But even with them at her back, Quetzalcoatl's grip on her spear was tight enough to make her knuckles pale. She knew what was coming. The temple loomed ahead, stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. At the top, the faint glow of dawn teased the horizon, its warmth brushing against the cold of night like a whispered promise. But it wasn't the sun that stirred fear in Quetzalcoatl's chest. It was him. She could feel him, even now, moving within the shadows of his mother's womb, watching from behind her ribs like a caged fire, waiting for the right moment to burn everything in his path. "We have no choice," Quetzalcoatl whispered to the stars, though she knew they needed no convincing. "If we don't stop him, he will rise and consume us all." But her words were not for them. They were for herself. She had been the brightest once. The moon, casting her silver glow across the night, dancing among the stars without fear. Now that light trembled, flickering beneath the weight of something greater, something she could not name but could feel pressing against her bones. As the stars began to ascend the temple steps, Quetzalcoatl hesitated, listening to the wind for something she couldn't quite explain. That's when she heard it. A heartbeat. Not Coatlicque's. This one was faster, stronger, like the rhythm of war drums echoing across the sky. Huitzilopochtli was awake. Quetzalcoatl's pulse quickened. Her hand tightened on the spear, but the cold had already begun to creep beneath her skin. She swallowed it down, lifting her chin as she led the stars higher, step by step. "He will not stop us," she told herself. But the wind carried his voice. "I am here." The temple erupted in golden light. Huitzilopochtli emerged not as a child but as a warrior, full-grown, draped in the fire of the sun, and armed with the serpent Zyakobel that hissed and twisted in his hand. His shield glinted, catching the first light of dawn and reflecting it like a second sun. His eyes found Quetzalcoatl at once, but he did not speak. He didn't have to. The first strike came faster than thought, the serpent lashing out and cracking against the stone beneath Quetzalcoatl's feet. She stumbled back, spear raised, but the heat of the weapon seared the air between them, pulling the breath from her lungs. "Stand your ground," she shouted, but the stars behind her flickered, stepping back as Huitzilopochtli descended the steps with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator. Quetzalcoatl lunged. Her spear cut through the air, striking toward his heart, but the serpent twisted, intercepting the blow with a burst of light. Sparks danced against the stone, and Quetzalcoatl was forced back again, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The stars rushed forward, their weapons flashing as they circled Huitzilopochtli, but the sun god moved like the wind, impossible to grasp, slipping through their ranks with each strike of the serpent. One by one, the stars fell, their light snuffed out as their bodies tumbled down the temple steps. Quetzalcoatl's heart pounded. She could see the faint glow of their scattered remains below, their sparks dimming as the earth swallowed them whole. But she did not fall back. Her spear spun in her hands, catching the faint slivers of moonlight still clinging to the sky. With a cry, she struck again, the blade slicing toward Huitzilopochtli's shoulder. This time, he caught it. His hand closed around the shaft of the spear, his strength holding it in place as if it weighed nothing at all. For a moment, their gazes met, sun against moon, fire against silver. "This is not your place anymore," he said softly. The serpent lashed out. Huitzilopochtli felt the force of it before she saw the strike. Her body lifted from the ground, weightless as she was hurled from the temple's peak. The stars blurred beneath her, the cold air slicing against her skin as she tumbled, spinning endlessly down the steps. Stone cracked beneath her body with each collision, and by the time she reached the foot of the temple, her light had dimmed, her silver glow flickering like the last ember of a dying flame. Her head came to rest at the base of the stairs, eyes wide and staring toward the heavens she could no longer touch. The stars watched in silence, their brilliance pale beneath the rising sun. Huitzilopochtli stood at the temple's peak, his gaze steady as the light of dawn washed over the land. His chest rose and fell slowly, the serpent curling at his side, its fangs still glistening with the echoes of battle. The stars would return, their light inevitable. But each night, Huitzilopochtli's shattered form would lie beneath the temple, her broken body a reminder that the sun had risen and that it would rise again. The hum of wings flickered through the silence, soft, barely there, yet impossible to ignore. It cut through the air like a whisper, too fast to follow, but lingering just long enough to leave behind the sense of something watching, something more than it seemed. The smallest creature could hold the fiercest spirit. That was the truth etched into the heart of the world, a lesson the Aztecs carried like a blade at their side. And no spirit burned brighter than the one who wore feathers of blue and green, whose heart pulsed with the fire of war. Huitzilopochtli did not thunder across the sky like other gods. His steps were lighter, but no less deadly. He came as a hum, a flash of color against the endless expanse of blue, striking before his enemies even knew he was there. To those who had seen him, he was impossible to forget. His body shimmered with iridescent light, feathers catching the sun as he moved, but his eyes were something else entirely. They held the weight of battles already won, of enemies cut down long before their blades could taste the air. The hummingbird was no fragile thing. It did not hesitate. It dove headfirst into danger, daring the wind to keep up. And so did he. The spear he carried was not shaped like those of men. It coiled in his hand, slithering and shifting, humming with the energy of the sun itself. Zyakobel, the fire serpent, curled along his arm, its scales gleaming like obsidian, its mouth flickering with blue flame. It wasn't a weapon. It was part of him, an extension of his will, as natural as breath, as relentless as time. His enemies knew this. They had learned it the hard way. When Huitzilopochtli struck, he moved like the hummingbird that bore his spirit, fast, merciless, a blur of fire and feathers. His spear cut through shadows and bone alike, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. The battlefield shimmered with heat in his presence, and the air buzzed, as if the hum of wings echoed long after the fight had ended. It wasn't just war that lived in him. It was protection. His people called him when they stood on the brink of darkness, when the weight of the world pressed heavy against their chests and the stars above seemed too distant to reach. And he answered, not as a roar, but as a hum just behind the ear, gentle and fierce all at once. The hummingbird did not fight for the sake of blood. It fought to survive, to defend what was sacred. So did he. Every time the sun rose, it carried his mark, its golden light chasing away the night, the stars, the broken pieces of Huitzilopochtli scattered across the earth. His presence was felt in the warmth that crept over mountaintops, and the soft rustle of feathers brushing against leaves just before dawn. There were those who said he never truly left the world, even after the battles ended. They swore they saw him in the flash of green darting between trees, and the brief glimmer of sunlight catching the edge of a spear far off in the distance. Huitzilopochtli was not bound by form. He was the hum of wings, the weight of the sun, the sharp edge of obsidian held tight in a trembling hand. And when the time came, when the world held its breath and waited for darkness to rise again, the hum would return. A flash of blue against the sky, a flicker of gold catching the first light of dawn. Because no matter how many times the night tried to reclaim the world, the hummingbird would always rise. The sun never rose on its own. It was dragged into the sky, pulled by unseen hands, each thread of light stitched carefully with sacrifice. The warmth that kissed the land each morning did not come without cost. Huitzilopochtli's fire needed fuel, and the only thing that burned bright enough was blood. On the highest temple steps, the air was thick, trembling with the weight of expectation. The crowd below stood still, eyes fixed on the figure at the summit, where the stone altar gleamed faintly under the breaking light of dawn. Each breath hung in the air, silent but heavy, as if the entire world was holding it together, waiting, hoping. The priest's hands trembled, but not with fear. This was devotion. His blade, smooth and curved like the crescent moon, reflected the sun's first rays. He raised it high, his voice soft but steady as he whispered the name that lived on every tongue in moments like this. Huitzilopochtli. The sun god was listening. He always was. The warrior on the altar did not flinch. His chest rose and fell in calm waves, muscles tense beneath painted skin, but his eyes held no fear. This was not an end for him. This was something greater. The light of dawn caught the feather in his headdress, blue and gold flickering against his dark hair, and for a moment he looked as if he already carried the sun inside him. The blade flashed. The sky shifted. As blood touched the stone, the sun seemed to pulse, its light thickening as it poured over the land, warm and heavy like honey. The wind stirred, curling around the temple like a living thing, brushing against the faces of those below. They knew. Each drop of blood was a thread in the fabric of existence, woven tightly to keep the world turning, to keep the stars from swallowing the sky. Without it, the sun would falter, the shadows would lengthen, and the cold hand of night would creep in until no light remained. The gods did not ask for sacrifice out of cruelty. They asked because the sun itself was a battlefield, and every day it rose was another war won. Huitzilopochtli stood at the front of that battle, his spear carving paths of fire through the darkness, but even he could not fight alone. The warriors knew this. That's why they climbed the steps without hesitation, why they bled beneath the open sky with eyes full of pride. Each heartbeat that spilled from their chests became part of the sun's rhythm, a drumbeat that pushed it higher until the shadows fled. It wasn't pain that lingered on the temple stones, it was love. A fierce, burning love that did not flinch, did not bow, did not break. Huitzilopochtli felt it. Every drop of blood was a prayer, and every prayer became a weapon in his hand. When the sun set, and the stars began their slow descent over the land, he gathered those prayers and carried them into the night, knowing he would need them when the battle began again. The people below understood that too. They carried the sun in their veins, their blood as sacred as the fire that burned in the sky. When they danced, their feet struck the earth like drums, echoing the rhythm of the sacrifices that kept the world breathing. Each step was a promise, each movement a reflection of the war that raged above. The sun was never safe. Even at its highest point, shadows crept at its edges, waiting for the chance to pull it down. Huitzilopochtli's spear kept them at bay, but he did not fight for himself. He fought for them, for every face that turned upward to meet the morning light, for every voice that whispered his name as the sky shifted from black to gold. And in return, they bled for him. The cycle never ended. The sun set, and with it, so did the lives of those who gave themselves willingly. But the next day, new warriors climbed the steps, their faces painted with the colors of dawn, their hearts steady as they lay beneath the rising sky. They knew the truth. The sun was not eternal. It lived only as long as their hearts beat for it, as long as the blades remained sharp and the stone remained warm beneath their touch. Each day was borrowed time, a gift given by those who walked before them, paid for in the only currency the gods accepted. The hum of wings drifted through the temple as the priest lowered his blade, his hand still stained red. In the distance, the sun climbed higher, bathing the land in light that seemed too bright, too full, as if the sacrifice had been heard, had been accepted. And somewhere, far beyond the edges of the sky, Huitzilopochtli's spear burned just a little brighter. The wind whispered through the desert, dry and restless, carrying grains of sand like memories across the empty expanse. The sun hung low, smoldering against the horizon, but it did not fall. It waited. The Mexica moved beneath that watchful sky, their footsteps leaving shallow marks in the earth, soon swallowed by the wind. Each step was heavier than the last, but none dared stop. Not while his voice still lingered, not while the hummingbirds thrummed softly beneath their ribs, nudging them forward even when their legs trembled. The priest at the front held the bundle close to his chest, arms wrapped protectively around it as if guarding a living heart. Within the dark cloth, Huitzilopochtli stirred, not with movement, but with presence. His weight was not felt by the body, but by the spirit. The god was restless, his fire flickering against the edges of their dreams, urging them to press on. They did not know the destination. They only knew the sign they waited for. A land where an eagle would rise, clutching a serpent in its talons, standing proud atop a prickly pear. That was where Huitzilopochtli would make his home, where the sun's fire would carve out a new world in his name. But the land ahead stretched endlessly, and the days bled into one another, blistering heat melting into frigid nights. Children clung to their mothers, warriors to their spears, and the elders whispered prayers to the sky, their words thin as smoke. Still, the priest walked forward. His eyes never wavered. Huitzilopochtli's voice echoed in his chest, a hum that sang through his bones, louder than thirst, louder than hunger. It was neither kind nor soft, but it was steady. And it would not stop until the god's will had been carved into stone and soil. One night, as the fires flickered low, the hummingbird appeared. A faint blur of blue and green against the darkness, its wings beating so fast they barely seemed to move at all. The priest's breath caught as the bird hovered above the altar stone, tilting its head as if listening to something just beyond reach. The wind held its breath. The hummingbird darted forward, spiraling through the air before disappearing into the black horizon. The priest understood. They broke camp before the first light touched the sky. The mountains watched in silence as they crossed valleys and streams, their feet bleeding against jagged stone. Time unraveled, but the god did not forget them. Each night, the hummingbird returned, darting through the firelight, reminding them the sun was watching, waiting. Then, after so many days the stars seemed to blur together, they saw it. Atop the lake's edge, where the water shimmered like obsidian beneath the rising sun, an eagle stood, golden feathers gleaming with the first light of morning. In its talons writhed the serpent, its body limp, caught beneath the gaze of the bird that bore the sun's fire. The Mexica fell to their knees. The priest stepped forward, tears welling unbidden as the weight of the bundle in his arms seemed to lift, as if the god himself were standing beside him, watching the eagle with eyes older than time. This was the place. Huitzilopochtli's voice did not rise in triumph. It was calm, certain, like the sun cresting the horizon, inevitable and blinding. The god did not need to speak. His warriors already knew. They set their spears into the ground. The drums never stopped. Their rhythm pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting, stretching across the city as if it held the sky in place. Tenochtitlan stood tall beneath the blazing sun, its stone temples piercing the heavens, casting long shadows that seemed to ripple like waves. At the highest point, where the wind whispered louder than the chants below, Huitzilopochtli watched. His name rolled off tongues like a war cry. His face was carved into temple walls, painted in bold strokes of blue and gold, his feathers burning bright as the fire in the hearts of his people. But it wasn't the stone or the paint that made him strong. It was the blood that spilled in his honor, the lives given willingly beneath the sun's gaze. He was more than a god. He was a banner, a shield, a spear thrust high in the air. To stand beneath him was to carry the weight of the sun on your back, to know that your steps were not your own but part of something larger, something that stretched beyond the horizon, beyond time itself. The Mexica were not born into greatness. They carved it from the earth with bare hands, hardened by hunger, sharpened by war. Other cities looked down at them, called them wanderers, outcasts without a home. But the Mexica knew something the others did not. They carried a god. And he did not kneel. Huitzilopochtli's fire burned in their chests, and that fire had no room for weakness. Each victory was his, each enemy that fell beneath obsidian blades another stone laid at the feet of his temple. The sun god's hunger was endless, but so was their devotion. When war came, they did not pray for peace. They sharpened their weapons and walked into the fray, knowing he walked with them. His spear struck first, a flash of blue and gold on the battlefield, and the enemy always faltered, their courage trembling beneath the weight of his gaze. To fight for Huitzilopochtli was not a choice. It was a birthright. The priests whispered that his blood ran through the veins of the Mexica, that each warrior who stood at the front lines carried a fragment of the god's fire within them. And so, they grew. City by city, the Mexica rose, each conquest lighting another flame at the base of Huitzilopochtli's temple. The stone steps ran red beneath bare feet, but it was not sorrow that filled the air. It was triumph. The sun shone brighter over Tenochtitlan with each sacrifice, its rays stretching further, bathing the land in gold until even the most distant cities could not deny the power that flowed from beneath the eagle's wings. Enemies became tributaries, their offerings piled high at the feet of the sun god, and as the empire stretched its arms across valleys and lakes, one truth became clear. Huitzilopochtli did not just protect the Mexica. He made them. Without him, they were wanderers. With him, they were unstoppable. The drums beat louder. The fire on the temple burned higher. And the god who wore feathers of blue and green watched it all, silent but proud, his spear pointed firmly at the sky. There was a time before this one. A time when the sun burned with different fire, and the world crumbled beneath skies that carried no mercy. The stars remember. They watched as each sun rose, lived, and fell. 4 times, the light flickered out. And now, in this age, the 5th sun hangs over the world, fragile and fierce, trembling with the weight of everything that came before. Huitzilopochtli stands at its heart. His hands grip the edges of the sky, pulling the sun forward with each breath the world takes. Without him, the light falters. Without him, the 5th sun would join the others, swallowed by the same shadows that left their bones scattered across the heavens. But not yet. This is his age. His fire bleeds across the horizon each morning, chasing away the cold hands of the night. The battles fought in the sky are not forgotten by those who walk beneath it. Every rise of the sun is another war won, another step forward in a cycle that has no mercy. The first sun drowned in jaguar's teeth. Its light was sharp, primal, and unforgiving. But the world beneath it was fragile, and when the beasts came, there was no place to hide. Their claws tore through stone and bone alike until nothing remained but silence. The second sun fell to the winds. The skies turned against the land, twisting with storms that swallowed the horizon. Feathered serpents rose from the clouds, their scales glinting beneath flashes of lightning, and the world shuddered beneath the weight of their hunger. The third sun burned with fire. The sky itself cracked open, and the flames poured down like rain, devouring forests and rivers without pause. Even the mountains bowed beneath the blaze, their peaks melting into molten rivers that carved the land anew. The fourth sun drowned in tears. The rain never ceased. It fell for days, then months, until the oceans rose and claimed the land. Those who did not flee were pulled beneath the waves, their voices swallowed by the water. But the 5th sun, this sun was born from war. Huitzilopochtli's spear carved it from the sky, his blood staining the horizon red as he fought to lift it higher. This sun was not given freely. It was taken, seized from the bones of gods who had long since fallen silent. The 5th sun carries the weight of sacrifice, and that sacrifice is not yet done. It hangs above the world, trembling but proud, its fire hungry for the blood that keeps it alive. The Mexica understand this better than anyone. They know the sun's hunger mirrors their own, and each heartbeat they offer is a thread in the fabric that holds the sky together. Without blood, the sun forgets. It dims, flickering like a dying flame, and the shadows that swallowed the first 4 suns creep closer, waiting for their chance to rise once more. But as long as Huitzilopochtli stands, they do not dare cross the threshold. His spear burns brighter than any star, and his wings hum with the fire of the gods who came before him. He carries the memory of the suns that fell, and with each sacrifice, his strength grows, binding the fifth sun tighter to the sky. Yet the cycle has no end. One day, even this sun will fall. One day, Huitzilopochtli's fire will flicker, and the shadows will rise to greet a world stripped bare. But not today. Today, the sun climbs higher, and the sky trembles with the weight of his name. The stone face of the calendar gleamed under the sun, carved deep with symbols that whispered of time's breath and the gods' endless march. Each line and spiral carried the weight of centuries, and though the stone was cold beneath the touch, it pulsed with the memory of fire. Time was not gentle. It did not drift softly like a feather on the wind. It struck, relentless and sharp, like the edge of an obsidian blade. And at its center, pushing the sun forward, stood Huitzilopochtli. The calendar was more than stone. It was a heartbeat, pounding in rhythm with the god of war. The Mexica read the stars not as distant points of light, but as echoes of the battles fought long before their time. Every day etched into the stone carried his presence, his steps counted in cycles that spiraled outward like ripples on water. 52 years. That was all the world was promised at once. A single breath in the endless expanse of the cosmos. Beyond that, uncertainty. When the last night of the cycle arrived, the fires in every home would be extinguished, and darkness would swallow the city. Only one light remained, flickering atop the sacred hill, where priests knelt in silence, waiting for the sign. Their blades, obsidian polished to a mirror sheen, were ready. Sacrifice was not a question. It was the price of time. The heart that beat beneath the stars had to be fed, and Huitzilopochtli's hunger could not be ignored. If the fire was lit anew, if the sun returned to its path, then the calendar turned once more. And if it didn't, there would be nothing left to count. But the sun always rose. Huitzilopochtli's spear pierced the shadows, holding them at bay, and the calendar spun forward, its edges biting deeper into the stone. Each day carried his weight, some for planting, some for harvest, and others stained red, marked for war. There were days when the god's voice rang louder than the cries of the city. Days when his presence burned so fiercely that even the air trembled. Those were the days of sacrifice, days where the calendar's pulse quickened, and the line between the living and the gods blurred. On those days, the hummingbird's wings echoed across the temple steps, and warriors painted their faces in the colors of the sun. The calendar had no mercy. It did not forget the past nor forgive the weak. Each turn of the stone reminded them that Huitzilopochtli had fought for the sun's place in the sky, and so must they. The priests whispered that each carving on the calendar was a wound, each symbol a scar left behind by the battles fought before this age. The cycle continued because of those scars. Without them, the world unraveled. And so, the Mexica watched the sky with careful eyes, reading Huitzilopochtli's will in the stars. They counted the days with reverence, knowing the calendar did not move without him. But time was a circle, and the fifth sun still burned, clinging to the heavens with the god's blood-stained hands. The stone calendar, though heavy, carried the sun's weight as if holding it in place. The day would come when it would turn for the last time. But not yet. Not while his spear still pointed toward the sky. The air was thick with the smell of burning incense as the priest, cloaked in feathers and robes of jaguar skin, stood at the edge of the temple. His gaze was fixed on the sky, where the sun hung like a ball of fire, its rays slashing through the dark clouds. It had been days since they had seen any rain, and the crops were beginning to wither. The ground was dry, cracked like the faces of the gods carved into stone. There were whispers among the people, voices laced with fear, wondering if the gods had turned their backs on them. The priest's heart beat in rhythm with the drums echoing from the city below, a pulse that felt like the pounding of the earth itself. His fingers twitched, reaching for the small bundle of sacred feathers in his hands. He had been chosen, like his ancestors before him, to read the signs that would determine their fate. And then it came. A flash of light, a streak across the sky so bright it burned the eyes of all who saw it. A comet, trailing behind it the scent of sulfur, the taste of war. It was an omen. A message from Huitzilopochtli himself. His fiery eyes were upon them, and he was not pleased. The priest dropped to his knees, eyes wide with realization. The comet was a sign of war, a warning that blood must be shed to quench the thirst of the sun. The people needed to hear this. There could be no peace, no rest. The sun would not rise higher unless the gods were fed. The calendar, the sacred cycle of time, demanded it. But what if the sign was not enough? As the days passed and the drought continued to strangle the land, other signs followed, flashes of lightning that split the sky in two, thunder that rattled the bones, and the eerie silence of the birds that once filled the air with song. Each of these signs, the priests knew, was Huitzilopochtli speaking to them. His voice was not loud, but it was powerful. In the crack of thunder, in the flash of the comet, in the stillness of the world around them, his message rang clear: action must be taken. Blood must flow. Every omen was tied to something larger, something woven into the fabric of existence itself. When Huitzilopochtli showed his anger, the droughts would follow, as if the earth itself was punished for a sin it could not recall. When the war drum sounded and the warriors marched, the signs came in flashes, eagles soaring overhead, the wind carrying the scent of battle, the sound of footsteps that seemed to echo from another world. Huitzilopochtli was there, guiding them. But the people knew that the gods did not speak for free. Their words were not mere whispers carried by the wind, they demanded action. Huitzilopochtli, with his spear and his war cry, was a god who did not ask for tribute. He demanded it. And that tribute was always paid in blood. The priests took their place on the sacred altars, preparing for the sacrifices that would follow. The gods' hunger was never sated, and the warriors, fueled by the fire of Huitzilopochtli's spirit, would answer the call. The sky itself seemed to tremble as they marched, their feet echoing with each step, a rhythm that mimicked the heartbeat of the earth. The warriors were a living extension of the gods' will, their swords raised high, ready to claim what was necessary for the sun to continue its journey. In the midst of these omens, the people did not stand idle. The signs were read, interpreted, and woven into the lives of those who lived beneath the weight of Huitzilopochtli's gaze. A drought was not just a problem for the farmers, it was a sign that the gods' favor had been lost, and the only way to restore balance was through sacrifice. The warriors, in turn, were not just fighting for land or power, they were fighting to keep the sun in the sky, to ensure that the fifth sun would continue to rise, no matter the cost. Each victory, each conquest, was a step in the endless cycle. Huitzilopochtli's warriors brought the enemy to their knees, their swords stained red with the life that kept the sun burning. And yet, even as the warriors returned, their hands raised in victory, the priests were already watching for the next sign. There was no rest, no peace, only the unending demands of the gods. The omens did not stop at the battlefield. They came in dreams, in the movements of animals, in the way the winds shifted. A dying bird was a sign of famine, a lone jaguar's growl in the night a harbinger of death. And when the warriors returned from the hunt, covered in blood and dust, the priests would read their faces, searching for signs in their expressions, their movements, their breath. Every word spoken, every gesture made, was part of the message. War was not just a matter of weapons, it was a matter of the gods' will, a call that had to be answered. It was a dance, a dangerous one, with the warriors spinning across the battlefield like the hummingbird on Huitzilopochtli's banner, and the people at home waiting, praying, hoping that the signs would lead them to victory, to life. The signs, when interpreted correctly, were the bridge between the gods and the people. And it was through the sacrifice of lives that the Mexica gave the gods what they wanted. But not just any life would do, only the finest, the bravest, the most dedicated. Only the ones who could carry the gods' fire within them and face the flames with their heads held high. As the final moments of the sacrifice drew near, the priests would whisper to Huitzilopochtli, their prayers rising into the heavens like the smoke from the burning incense. The signs had been read. The will of the gods had been fulfilled. And with each drop of blood that fell to the earth, they knew the sun would rise again. But would it? Would the omens continue to speak of victory, or would they turn, darken, and show the wrath of a god too long ignored? Only time would tell. The priests, with their eyes to the sky, would wait for the answer. The cries of the eagle pierced the morning air, a sharp, unmistakable sound that echoed through the mist. The Mexica, tired and broken from years of wandering, stood in awe. They had come so far, from their home in Aztlan, their hearts heavy with the weight of their journey. For years, they had searched, chasing the vision that had been promised to them. A place where they would be free, where their god, Huitzilopochtli, would guide them to their destiny. And now, in this quiet moment by the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, the prophecy was being fulfilled. The eagle perched on a cactus, its wings spread wide as if to embrace the heavens. There, in its fierce, unrelenting gaze, the people saw not just a bird, but a divine command. Huitzilopochtli had spoken to them in dreams, in signs, and now he was speaking to them again, through this very eagle. This was the moment they had waited for. Their God had shown them the way. Here, the vision seemed to say, "This is where you will build." The Mexica had been restless for so long, wandering from place to place, always searching, always waiting. They had faced trials and hardships beyond imagining. Famine, disease, betrayal. But the vision had always been with them, a promise of a future that only Huitzilopochtli could deliver. His voice was not one of whispers, it was a roar, a command that could not be ignored. And now, as the eagle took flight above the water, there was no turning back. With each beat of the eagle's wings, the sky seemed to grow brighter. The world around them, once heavy with uncertainty, now felt electric with possibility. The people were still, their gazes locked on the eagle's every movement, knowing that this moment of clarity, was theirs. "This is the place," the priest cried, his voice quivering with awe. "The place our God has chosen for us." A tear slipped down his cheek, not from sadness but from the overwhelming weight of what was unfolding. The Mexica knew that they were no longer just wandering. They were being called to greatness. The land beneath their feet would soon hold the weight of their empire. The foundations of Tenochtitlan would be laid, not by their hands alone, but by the will of the God who had carried them this far. With the eagle still soaring above them, the Mexica began their work. The sun was high, its light dancing on the surface of the lake, casting long shadows across the land. The city they would build would be like no other. They would shape the earth, make it bend to their will. In the place where once there had been only water and mud, they would create a mighty city, the heart of an empire that would rise from nothing but faith and divine guidance. But even as the people worked, they felt the weight of Huitzilopochtli's gaze upon them. His expectations were clear. He had led them here, shown them the way. And now, they had to prove themselves worthy. It was not just enough to build a city, they had to build a city that would honor him, a city worthy of the God who had blessed them with the vision. The sweat on their brows, the calluses on their hands, the exhaustion in their bones, it was all part of the sacrifice they made. Huitzilopochtli had chosen them. He had commanded them to act. And they would not fail him. The waters of Lake Texcoco sparkled with a promise, reflecting the sky above like a mirror. The Mexica began to create their home from nothing. The city rose from the lake, its causeways stretching across the water like veins of life, binding the people to the divine will of their God. Every stone they placed was a tribute to Huitzilopochtli. Every temple they built was a testament to his power. And every step they took on that land was a step closer to their destiny. In the years to come, Tenochtitlan would become a beacon, not just for the Mexica, but for all those who believed in the strength of the gods. It would be a place where the sun would shine brighter than ever before, where the eagle would always soar, and where the people would never forget the vision that had led them here. But even as the first walls went up, and the first homes were built, the Mexica felt the weight of something even greater than the city taking shape around them. The great struggle was yet to come. The people of Tenochtitlan would rise, yes, but they would rise with the knowledge that Huitzilopochtli's expectations would always remain with them. The eagle, their symbol of the divine, had not just shown them where to build. It had shown them who they were meant to become. And no matter what trials lay ahead, no matter the battles, the bloodshed, the sacrifices, they would rise, again and again, until their city stood as the shining testament to the God who had guided them from nothing to greatness. The vision at Lake Texcoco had not just marked the beginning of a city, it had marked the beginning of an empire. An empire that would be built on the unwavering faith of a people, led by the hand of Huitzilopochtli himself. And as the eagle flew higher into the sky, the Mexica looked up in reverence, knowing that their destiny had been sealed. They were no longer just a wandering people. They were a people with purpose, with power, with the gods at their backs. And the city that rose from the waters would stand, forevermore, as a testament to the vision of Huitzilopochtli, a city that would never be forgotten. The sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the lake as the people of Tenochtitlan gathered around the heart of their city. The sound of drums filled the air, their beats heavy with anticipation. There, standing as a monument to their devotion, was the Templo Mayor, the great temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, their warrior god. It was more than just a building. It was the pulse of their world, the very embodiment of their connection to the divine. From the base, it rose higher and higher, its stone steps worn from countless feet climbing toward the heavens. The Great Pyramid towered above the city like a giant, its massive presence casting a shadow over everything beneath it. As the temple rose into the sky, it seemed to touch the stars themselves, as if reaching out to the gods. The Mexica had always believed that Huitzilopochtli was not just their god, but their protector, the one who had guided them to this land and had helped them forge an empire. And now, they were building a place worthy of him, a place where his spirit could live on forever. The Templo Mayor would be the center of their universe, a sacred space where the earth met the sky, where the mortal and the divine were one. It was not just a temple. It was a statement. It was a promise. To Huitzilopochtli and to themselves. With every stone that was laid, the people of Tenochtitlan poured their blood, sweat, and spirit into the temple's construction. They knew that their god's power was not something that could be contained in a mere building. Huitzilopochtli was a force that shaped the very world. The temple, though majestic, was only a reflection of his strength and grandeur. Every stone had to be perfect, every line straight, every step a reminder of their unwavering devotion. At the summit of the Templo Mayor stood two sanctuaries, each dedicated to the gods of the Mexica, Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the rain god. But it was Huitzilopochtli's sanctuary that commanded the most attention. It was here that the Mexica made their offerings, where the blood of warriors and captives alike was spilled in honor of the god who had led them to greatness. The air around the temple seemed to hum with energy, thick with the weight of sacrifice. The Mexica understood that their god demanded offerings, but these were not given out of fear. No. The offerings were a way of showing their love and respect. It was the only way to keep the sun rising each day, to ensure that the god's power remained strong, to honor the very source of life itself. In the eyes of the Mexica, Huitzilopochtli was not a distant deity, removed from their lives. He was a part of their world, living and breathing in the temple that stood at the heart of their city. As the ritual sacrifices were made, the blood of warriors flowed like a river, soaking the stones beneath the temple. The Mexica believed that with each drop spilled, the strength of Huitzilopochtli grew. The temple steps were lined with statues and carvings of eagles, jaguars, and serpents, symbols of the warrior god's power and might. The air was thick with incense, and the chants of the priests echoed like a call to arms, urging the people to remember that they were the children of the sun, the heirs to a legacy that stretched back to the beginning of time itself. The Templo Mayor was not just a physical place. It was a living testament to the Mexica's unwavering faith, their commitment to the gods, and their desire to honor Huitzilopochtli in the most profound way possible. It was a place where the heavens and the earth met, where the past and the future could collide in a flash of divine light. For the people of Tenochtitlan, the temple was the very center of their world. It stood as a constant reminder of their place in the cosmic order, their duty to uphold the balance between life and death, light and darkness. And though the temple was built with stone, its power came from something far deeper, a connection to the gods that could never be broken. And yet, as the people watched the temple rise, there was also a sense of quiet reflection. Each stone, each brick, each carving was not just an offering but a promise. Huitzilopochtli's power was not something that could be taken for granted. The Mexica knew that their strength, their very existence, depended on the god's favor. They built the temple not just to honor him, but to ensure that his light would continue to shine upon them. The Templo Mayor was their legacy, their gift to the god who had given them everything. It was a symbol of their determination, their resilience, and their belief that, with Huitzilopochtli's guidance, they could conquer anything. The temple would stand through the ages, its stones weathered by time, but its spirit eternal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the light from the temple seemed to shimmer, casting a golden glow over the city. The people of Tenochtitlan stood together, their eyes fixed on the Templo Mayor, knowing that they were a part of something much greater than themselves. The temple was a place where the past, present, and future converged, where the gods walked among them, and where the very heartbeat of their civilization could be felt in every corner. And as they stood, united in their devotion, they could hear the call of the warrior god himself, urging them to continue their march toward greatness. The Templo Mayor was not just a building. It was a promise that Huitzilopochtli's light would always guide them, that his strength would never falter, and that the Mexica would rise, always and forever, in the name of the sun. The sun's rays pierced through the early morning mist, casting long shadows across the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco. The city of Tenochtitlan stood proudly in the heart of the lake, its canals cutting through the stone and earth like veins carrying life through the body. It was more than just a city. It was a divine creation, laid out with the precision of the stars, each corner of it reflecting the will of Huitzilopochtli himself. Every stone, every temple, every street was a testament to the god of the sun and war, guiding the Mexica through the rhythms of life and death, light and darkness. As the sun rose higher, the city seemed to awaken with it, coming alive in ways that echoed the sacred cycles of time. The Mexica had built Tenochtitlan not just as a center of power, but as a reflection of the cosmos itself. Its design was no accident. It was intentional, an embodiment of the divine order. The center of it all, the Templo Mayor, stood at the heart of the city like a beating heart in the chest of a living god. The rest of the city radiated outward from that sacred spot, each avenue a beam of light extending from the central sun. Tenochtitlan was a city that mimicked the heavens. Just as the sun travels across the sky, so too did the streets stretch out from the temple. The city was divided into 4 quadrants, each one representing one of the 4 cardinal directions. The north, south, east, and west were not just directions, they were divine territories ruled by gods, and each corner of Tenochtitlan was aligned with one of those cosmic powers. But it wasn't just the layout that reflected the divine influence of Huitzilopochtli. It was the very life that flowed through the city, from the markets to the temples, from the warriors to the priests. Tenochtitlan was not only the capital of a great empire, it was a place where the god of the sun and war resided. Every action, every decision, every ritual was tied to his guidance, his protection, and his power. The canals that ran through the city were like arteries carrying the flow of life. They allowed for travel, trade, and communication, but they also mirrored the cycles of the sun. Water was life, and the Mexica saw the water as a reflection of the sun itself, its life-giving power flowing through their city just as the sun's rays gave life to the earth. The bridges that spanned the canals were not just practical, they were symbolic. They connected the earthly to the divine, allowing the people to walk between the realms of the gods and the realm of the living. Every part of Tenochtitlan was designed with a purpose. The city was a reflection of the divine order Huitzilopochtli had established, a physical manifestation of the heavens on earth. The careful planning of its layout ensured that the people were always connected to their god, always reminded that they were the children of the sun, living in a world that Huitzilopochtli himself had created. The Templo Mayor, towering above everything else, was the axis around which the entire city revolved. From the top of the temple, you could see the whole city stretched out beneath you, a perfect reflection of the world itself. The Mexica believed that the temple was the center of the universe, the point where the sun's power came to rest. It was not just a place of worship, it was a place where the gods lived among the people, where the cycles of life and death were played out in real time. The city was also a battlefield, a place where the will of the sun god was made manifest through the warriors who fought for the Mexica. The warriors were the ones who ensured that Huitzilopochtli's light would never fade. They were his chosen ones, the ones who carried his power into the world, striking down the enemies of the sun. Their sacrifices ensured that the sun would rise each day, that the forces of darkness would never overcome the light. But the warrior's life was not easy. The city was a place of constant tension, of constant preparation for the battles to come. Yet, there was a sense of unity in the city, a sense that everyone had a role to play in ensuring the sun's power would never diminish. The warriors fought for their people, the priests offered their sacrifices, and the people of Tenochtitlan carried on their daily lives, each person connected to the divine in their own way. The layout of Tenochtitlan mirrored the journey of the sun itself. Just as the sun rose in the east, reached its zenith in the south, and set in the west, so too did the people of Tenochtitlan move through their lives, guided by the light of Huitzilopochtli. The people lived in harmony with the rhythms of the sun, knowing that their very existence was tied to the god's power. Every day was a gift, every moment a reflection of the divine order. As the sun sank lower in the sky, the shadows grew long across the city. The streets that had once been bathed in the warm light now lay in darkness, but the people did not fear. They knew that the sun would rise again, just as it had every day before, and that Huitzilopochtli's light would guide them through another day. The city was a living reflection of the eternal cycle, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth that played out in the cosmos above and in the hearts of the people below. Tenochtitlan was not just a city. It was a temple. It was a battlefield. It was a place where the divine and the mortal coexisted, where the sun itself reached down and touched the earth. The people of Tenochtitlan knew that they were the children of the sun, and they lived each day with the knowledge that they were walking in the light of their God. The city, with its perfect design and its deep connection to the heavens, was the ultimate tribute to Huitzilopochtli, a living testament to the power of the sun, the light, and the divine. And as long as the sun shone, Tenochtitlan would stand, unbroken, unyielding, and forever in the light of Huitzilopochtli. The fires of conquest flickered long before the armies began their march. In the dark of night, the rulers stood atop the great temple, their faces carved with the weight of power and destiny. The stone beneath their feet felt alive, pulsing with the heartbeat of the god who watched from the heavens. In the distance, the city lay silent, but above, the stars burned fiercely, as if they too awaited the command. Huitzilopochtli's presence loomed over them like the midday sun, blinding, searing, impossible to ignore. The god of war did not whisper, he demanded. His will was a fire that coursed through the veins of rulers, igniting visions of expansion, glory, and blood. When the priests cast their eyes toward the horizon, they did not see lands belonging to others. They saw the edges of the sun's light, and beyond that, the shadows that needed to be driven out. War was never just about land. It was never just about gold or prisoners. Each conquest was the unfolding of divine prophecy, the continuation of a story written by the gods long before the first stone of Tenochtitlan was laid. Every ruler who stood beneath Huitzilopochtli's gaze knew this. To fight was not a choice, it was duty. To refuse would mean risking the favor of the very force that kept the sun moving through the sky. When the warriors assembled at the temple steps, their feathered headdresses glistened in the firelight, the obsidian tips of their spears reflecting the stars. The emperor spoke not as a man, but as a vessel for Huitzilopochtli's will. His words carried the weight of the sun itself, each syllable pressing down on the hearts of those who listened. "You are the hand of the god," he would say, his voice echoing against the temple walls. The sun must feed. No one looked away. To hesitate meant doubt, and doubt was the enemy of the light. The people had been forged in war, shaped by the same divine fire that had burned since the beginning of time. They knew what was expected. As the armies moved forward, the banners of the sun god fluttered in the wind like wings of fire. To the cities that lay ahead, they were an omen, a shadow stretching across their lands, a reminder that resistance was not against flesh and bone, but against the force that carried the sun across the heavens. The rulers knew this well. Each conquest added to the greatness of Tenochtitlan, but it also reaffirmed the city's place in the cosmic order. Huitzilopochtli's will was not questioned. The lands brought under the banner of the Mexica became part of something far greater than borders and laws. They became threads in the great fabric woven by the gods, each one ensuring the sun's survival for another day. Failure was unthinkable. If the armies faltered, the balance shifted. Without war, the sun weakened. Without offerings, the light dimmed. The rulers bore this weight with unshakable resolve. When they stood before the people, they wore the god's strength like armor. Every victory was a reminder that Huitzilopochtli favored them, and every defeat was a call to rise again. The conquered cities were not just prizes. They were offerings, sacrifices to the god who demanded not wealth, but the pulse of life itself. The warriors who returned from battle did not speak of greed. They spoke of fulfilling a sacred contract, one that stretched beyond moral comprehension. Even in times of peace, the weight of conquest hung heavy over the city. The priests watched the skies for signs, their eyes scanning the heavens for the flicker of light that might signal the god's desire. Clouds drifting too slowly, stars falling from their places, the wind howling at night, every omen was taken seriously. The sun's survival depended on it. The rulers walked with this knowledge, feeling the sun's heat on their backs with each step. It was not a burden, but a reminder. As long as the sun rose, they were fulfilling their purpose. But the sun's path was never certain. Each dawn could be the last if the god's hunger was not satisfied. The temple remained the anchor, the place where the world above and below met. From its heights, the emperor could see the expanse of the empire stretching in all directions. But his gaze always drifted beyond that, toward the distant lands still untouched by Huitzilopochtli's light. It was there that the next battle awaited, and with it, the chance to secure another day beneath the sun. The wind carried the scent of war long before the first steps of the warriors touched the soil. It whispered through the stone corridors of Tenochtitlan, curling around the great temple like an unseen hand. The city stirred beneath its weight, for everyone knew what it meant when the drums began to sound. In the heart of the city, the fire at Huitzilopochtli's altar burned brighter, licking at the sky as if hungry for what was to come. The priests moved silently around it, their faces shadowed by the flicker of flames. They could feel the god's presence, sharp and electric, pulsing in the heavy air. It was a call that could not be ignored. The warriors knew it too. Each one had grown up with the stories, the great battles where the sun god had struck down the moon and hurled stars from the sky. His was not the soft hand of mercy, but the hard edge of obsidian, sharp enough to carve paths through mountains and empires alike. To follow him meant glory, but it also meant blood. And there would be blood. As the first light of dawn crept over the city, the warriors gathered at the temple steps. The golden rays stretched across their armor, dancing across shields and feathered crests. They stood in rows that stretched endlessly down the causeways, waiting for the command that would send them forward. Each man carried the weight of 1,000 ancestors, but none bowed beneath it. They had been born for this. When the emperor stepped forward, his voice carried no hesitation. "The god walks with us," he said, and that was enough. The march began with a thunder that rolled through the valleys, shaking the earth beneath the feet of those who watched from distant cities. To see the Mexica armies move was to witness the rising of a storm, slow at first, but inevitable in its force. There was no hiding from it, no pleading that could stop its advance. Huitzilopochtli led them in spirit, his wings unfurling over every battlefield. In the cries of warriors and the clash of steel, his voice echoed, demanding strength. Those who fell in his name did not die, they ascended, their spirits becoming part of the sun's light. Every victory was etched into the sky, and every defeat was a reminder that the god's hunger never slept. It was never just about land. Each conquest stretched the borders of the empire, but more than that, it fed the fires at the temple. Every step forward was an offering, a thread in the great tapestry that ensured the sun's path would not falter. The god had not chosen a single emperor or warrior, he had chosen an entire people, and through them, his will shaped the world. The conquered cities stood in silence when the warriors entered. Resistance was brief, fleeting against the tide that swept over them. The banners of Huitzilopochtli rose above their temples, casting shadows over streets that once belonged to other gods. But there was no cruelty in the god's path, only necessity. The sun could not rise without sacrifice. The balance of the cosmos rested on the edge of the sword, and it was the Mexica who carried it. Those who joined them became part of that order, their offerings mingling with those of the warriors who had come before. At night, the fires of conquest flickered against the dark, and the priests read the stars for signs. Huitzilopochtli's favor could be felt in the wind, tugging at the edges of the empire like an unseen thread pulling the sun higher into the sky. The god's path did not end, it stretched endlessly beyond the horizon, calling for more. In the stillness of dawn, the warriors returned to the temple steps, their faces marked with the weight of what they had seen. They knelt beneath the rising sun, offering thanks in silence. The city awoke to the sound of drums once more, and the cycle began again. Far from Tenochtitlan, the next conquest waited, and with it, the promise that the sun would rise for another day. The air in the temple is thick with anticipation. The great stone walls hum with the presence of the god as the priests move silently through their sacred rituals. Every gesture is precise, every word a prayer to Huitzilopochtli. The fire crackles in the center, its flames dancing, reflecting the light of the gods that shines from the altar. The smell of burning incense mingles with the faint scent of blood from the previous night's offerings. It is a place where the veil between the mortal and divine worlds is thin. In this moment, the priest's breath and the gods will become one. For the Mexica, these rituals were not mere acts of devotion, they were the pulse of the universe. The priests, draped in sacred garb and adorned with feathers that shimmered like the stars, were the vessels through which Huitzilopochtli's power flowed. They stood at the intersection of life and death, calling forth the god's guidance. To them, the god was not just a distant celestial being, but a living presence that demanded constant reverence. Behind them, the warriors stood ready, their bodies honed like the blades they carried. Their training was grueling, a constant test of endurance and spirit. But it was not just their bodies that they sharpened, it was their souls, for in the eyes of Huitzilopochtli, there was no separation between the two. The warrior's strength was the strength of the sun itself. The bond between priest and warrior was unspoken, yet as vital as the air they breathed. The priests performed their rituals to invoke Huitzilopochtli's favor, and the warriors, in turn, went into battle carrying the weight of those prayers. They knew that each conquest, each sacrifice, was a link in the chain that kept the sun rising each day. Their every action, from the smallest ritual to the greatest battle, was in honor of the god. The priests' chants echoed throughout the night, the rhythm a heartbeat that pulsed through the city. Each word was a plea, a command, a binding of the mortal and divine. They offered up the blood of the brave, and with each drop, they ensured the god would not falter. They spoke of past victories, of battles fought and won, and in doing so, they wove the fabric of the future. The warriors, gathered in the great halls beneath the towering walls of the temple, absorbed these prayers as their own. They understood that every drop of sweat, every moment of suffering, was a part of the grand design that Huitzilopochtli had set in motion. The training of the warriors was as intense as the rituals themselves. From an early age, the young men were brought into the discipline of war. They trained in the art of combat, learning not just how to wield a sword but how to channel their very essence into the strike. Each warrior's path was defined not just by their skill, but by their spiritual devotion. To be a warrior of Huitzilopochtli meant more than simply fighting, it meant embodying the fierce, unwavering strength of the god. They were not just soldiers, they were the sun's emissaries on earth. Every training session was a test of faith. The warriors learned to move as one, to work together as a single force, unified by the will of their god. Their weapons became extensions of their bodies, and in the heat of battle, they did not fight for themselves, but for Huitzilopochtli's eternal glory. The clashing of their weapons on the battlefield was a symphony, each blow a note in the divine song that echoed through the heavens. In the quiet moments before battle, the priests and warriors would gather together, standing in unity beneath the great stone statues of Huitzilopochtli. The priest would offer a final prayer, and the warriors would listen, their faces set with resolve. They knew that what awaited them on the battlefield was not just a fight for land or power, but a sacred duty to ensure that the sun would rise again. The warriors' sacrifices were great, but so too were their rewards. The very act of battle, the shedding of blood, was seen as an offering to Huitzilopochtli. Each enemy slain, each victory won, was a tribute to the god. The fiercest warriors were often chosen to stand before the altar, their sacrifices woven into the great tapestry of the sun's cycle. And as they gave their blood, so too did the god give them strength. In battle, the warriors saw themselves as instruments of Huitzilopochtli's will. Their hearts beat in time with the rhythm of the drums, their bodies moved in sync with the divine energy that filled the air. Every battle was a test of their faith, of their loyalty to the god. The priests, who had trained them, watched from the temple, their eyes fixed on the warriors below. They knew that the god's power flowed through these men, that the strength of the sun itself was in their hands. The warriors who returned victorious would be honored, their names sung by the priests in chants that rose to the heavens. Their bodies, battered and bruised, would be cleansed and prepared for the next journey. But no matter how many battles they fought, how many victories they won, the warriors knew that it was never just about the conquest. It was always about the god. It was always about ensuring that the sun would never fade. As the years passed, the relationship between the priests and warriors grew even more profound. Together, they upheld the delicate balance of life and death, of war and peace. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, under the shadow of the great temple, the connection between the divine and the mortal was never broken. The priests continued their rituals, and the warriors continued their training, bound together in a cycle that honored the sun god's will. And as long as the warriors fought with the fire of Huitzilopochtli burning in their hearts, the sun would rise. Every victory, every sacrifice, every prayer was a testament to the god who watched over them, ensuring that the sun would never set on the Mexica people. The drums thundered through the air, deep and resonant, stirring the hearts of every soul who gathered in the sacred city. The earth itself seemed to hum with anticipation as the Mexica people readied themselves for the most sacred of all festivals. The festival of Panquetzalizli had arrived. The streets of Tenochtitlan were awash in vibrant colors, the air thick with the scent of flowers and incense, and the sound of chanting filled every corner. It was a time of celebration, of joy and remembrance, a time to honor the divine, and more importantly, the god who had saved them from the eternal night. For 12 days, the city would pulse with the heartbeat of Huitzilopochtli himself. It was not simply a festival, it was the reenactment of a cosmic victory, a celebration of the triumph of light over darkness. The Mexica believed that their very survival rested on the power of Huitzilopochtli. The god's strength was theirs. His victory over Coelzaqui, the moon goddess, was their victory too. Every year, this battle between day and night was relived through their rituals, ensuring that the god's light would never fade. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. As the sun sank lower on the first evening, the preparations began. The people, adorned in their finest robes, lined the streets to the temple of Huitzilopochtli. The priests, with their elaborate headdresses of feathers and gold, stood at the ready. Their faces were set, their eyes filled with purpose, for they knew what this day meant. This festival wasn't just about honoring Huitzilopochtli, it was about reaffirming their place in the universe. It was about ensuring that the sun would rise again. The flame at the center of the temple flickered in the growing dusk, casting long shadows across the stone. The warriors, having spent countless hours in rigorous training, now donned their armor, ready to step into the roles they had been born to play. They were the champions of the god, his soldiers in a never-ending battle. The bloodshed that had sustained Huitzilopochtli's power throughout the year now called for one final offering, and they were prepared to give it. As the festival began, the first thing one noticed was the roar of the drums, louder and louder, shaking the very bones of the city. The sound was not just music, it was a summons. It called the people to remember. It reminded them of the night when Huitzilopochtli fought against the dark forces that sought to swallow the world whole. He had not only defended the heavens, but had also secured the promise of daylight for every generation to come. This was the god of war, but also the god of light. And on this night, his victory would echo through every street, every home, every heart. The people moved as one, their voices rising in song and prayer. The city transformed into a living, breathing tribute to Huitzilopochtli. Women carried flowers to the temple, their faces shining with reverence. Children danced in the streets, their feet light and quick as they mimicked the great battles of the past. The warriors, with their faces painted and their hearts beating to the rhythm of the drums, stood in formation, ready to offer their strength once again. The tension in the air was palpable as the priests gathered around the Great Pyramid at the center of the city. They chanted the sacred words, summoning the god's presence. The flames grew brighter as they called forth the god's spirit. Then, from the darkness, came the figure that would bring the festival's central moment to life, the warrior who would embody Huitzilopochtli himself. Draped in feathers, his body painted with the sacred colors of the sun, he stood tall and proud. He was not just a man, he was the living representation of the god. With every step he took, it was as though Huitzilopochtli himself walked among the people. His movements were powerful, his presence overwhelming, and the crowd fell silent in awe. The reenactment of the cosmic battle began, a battle not fought with words, but with fierce action. As the warrior who portrayed Huitzilopochtli climbed the steps of the temple, the crowd held its collective breath. The warriors who represented the forces of darkness, embodying Quetzalcoatl, stood at the base of the pyramid, waiting for their inevitable defeat. It was more than just a performance, it was a symbol of the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between hope and despair. The warrior of Huitzilopochtli reached the summit of the pyramid, the highest point in the city. From here, he could see everything, the streets below, the people gathered to witness the divine reenactment. His eyes shone with the power of the sun. And as he raised his spear high, he shouted to the heavens, a cry that pierced the night air. It was the sound of triumph. The sun had risen, and it would never fall. The battle raged on as the forces of darkness fought with everything they had. But just as they had been defeated by Huitzilopochtli's unwavering might long ago, so too were they defeated here. The struggle was fierce, but it was a struggle that could never truly be won by darkness. With one final blow, Huitzilopochtli struck down the forces of the night, sending them into retreat. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the city, for they knew that the god had triumphed again. As the last of the darkness was swept away, the sun rose in all its glory. The people looked up, their faces lifted to the sky, and they knew in their hearts that Huitzilopochtli's victory had been secured for another year. The cycle would continue. The light would shine. The god had fought, and the people would be safe once more. The festival of Panquetzalizli was more than a celebration, it was a living memory of the god's power, a reminder of the eternal battle between light and darkness. Every year, the Mexica people gathered together to honor this victory, knowing that they too were part of something much larger than themselves. The drums faded as the night wore on, but the memory of the god's strength lingered in their hearts, a beacon that would guide them until the next festival, when they would again celebrate the triumph of Huitzilopochtli over the darkness. The silence of the crowd was broken only by the rhythmic pounding of drums, echoing in the still air like a heartbeat. Tenochtitlan, the magnificent city of the Mexica, seemed to hold its breath. At the top of the Great Pyramid, the priests moved in unison, their bodies swaying with a purpose that was both solemn and awe-inspiring. Below them, thousands of eyes were locked on the altar, where a single, trembling figure lay awaiting the sacred ritual. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The day was not one for joy, but for something far more profound. It was a day of devotion, of giving, of sustaining the very force that gave life to the sun, to the land, and to the people. It was a day for Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, of the sun, and of the Mexica people himself. Each year, this moment arrived. The people of Tenochtitlan had long understood that the sun's journey across the sky was not guaranteed. The sun, just like the Mexica themselves, needed to be protected, nourished, and above all, sustained. The people believed that this task fell to them. To make the sun rise again, to keep the day from slipping into darkness, a sacrifice was required, one that would honor Huitzilopochtli and ensure his protection of the empire. On this day, a young warrior was chosen. His fate had been sealed long before this moment. He was not a victim, he was a volunteer, honored to offer his life in the service of the God who had protected his people for centuries. To be selected for the sacrifice was seen as the greatest honor. He would become the embodiment of the god himself, a living vessel for Huitzilopochtli's power. He would become the heart of the empire, and his sacrifice would feed the sun and keep the empire strong. As the high priests prepared for the ritual, they called upon the power of the god. Their chants filled the air, their voices rising in a chorus of devotion. The crowd fell into a hushed reverence, their eyes fixed on the altar. In the distance, the sun hung low in the sky, casting its golden light over the city. The moment had come. With a single, sweeping motion, the high priest raised the obsidian blade. The air seemed to freeze in that instant, as if time itself were holding its breath. And then, with an act as old as the empire itself, the blade descended. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by an overwhelming silence. It was not a sound of horror, but one of reverence, for the ritual had been carried out with such care, such purpose. The blood of the warrior flowed, offering life to the god who would ensure the sun would rise again. The people of Tenochtitlan did not weep for the warrior who had given his life, they wept for the life of the sun, the very source of their existence. The sacrifice was a renewal, a rebirth, a promise that the god would protect them from the darkness. As the blood pooled on the altar, the priests began their final chants, invoking Huitzilopochtli's power to renew the strength of the sun. The warrior, now lifeless, had given all that he could, his heart, his spirit, his very essence, so that the sun might shine on for another day, another year. His sacrifice was the linchpin in the cosmic cycle, the force that kept the darkness at bay and the sun in motion across the sky. The ritual did not end with the sacrifice itself. It continued with a great feast, as the people gathered to honor the god, their beloved Huitzilopochtli, who had granted them life, and whose will they had followed. The hearts of warriors and priests alike were united in purpose and understanding of the sacred bond between the people and the divine. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth was not merely a concept, it was a living reality for the Mexica, and they felt it pulse through their veins with every step, every word, every breath. There was no question in the minds of the people, this was the price of life, the price of the sun. They had long understood that Huitzilopochtli, in his brilliance, demanded both devotion and sacrifice. To live under the sun, to feel its warmth on their skin, they knew they must give back, ensuring that the god's power was never diminished. It was a delicate balance, and the Mexica embraced it with an understanding far beyond what many could comprehend. The sacrifices were not cruel, not without meaning, they were an offering to a god who had given them everything. In the silence that followed, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the people offered their thanks. The Great Pyramid loomed high above them, its stone steps reflecting the fading light of day, and they knew that tomorrow, the sun would rise again, just as it always had. The cycle would continue. And the heart of the empire, the sacrifice, would be remembered, for it was the very act that allowed them to live. As the stars began to twinkle above, the people filed away, the weight of the day settling into their hearts. They were tired, but they were fulfilled. The sun had been sustained. The god had been honored. And for one more day, the light would shine. But even as they walked through the darkened streets, their thoughts would linger on the warrior who had given it all, the one whose sacrifice had ensured that they would see another dawn. This was the way of the Mexica, the way of the sun, the way of Huitzilopochtli. Each life, each sacrifice, was a small part of a much larger truth. And in that truth, they found their purpose. There is a moment when the earth speaks. It murmurs softly at first, as if testing the air, but when it is ready, it erupts, releasing centuries of stories, forgotten whispers, and memories buried deep beneath its surface. When the archaeologists first set foot near the Templo Mayor, they did not expect what they would find. The ancient stones beneath their feet had been silent for so long, their voices swallowed by time. But now, they were about to be heard. The excavation site was a battlefield of sorts, a sacred ground where the past and present collided. As the first shovelful of earth was removed, a chill ran down the spine of the worker, as if the land itself recognized the intrusion. The air was thick with anticipation, and the ground seemed to hum with a distant energy, one that had not been felt for over 500 years. And then, there it was. A small, glimmering piece of something, an obsidian blade, carefully crafted, its edge sharp enough to cut through the very fabric of time. With trembling hands, the archaeologist brushed off the dirt and held the blade up to the light. It seemed to glow with a life of its own, as if it carried the spirit of the god it was once meant to honor. This was no ordinary artifact. It was a testament to the Mexica's devotion, their reverence, and the power they believed flowed through Huitzilopochtli's veins. As more of the temple's ruins were uncovered, the pieces began to fall into place. A vast, grand structure once stood here, towering and magnificent, a symbol of the Mexica's strength, power, and connection to the divine. The Templo Mayor had been the heart of Tenochtitlan, a place where the god Huitzilopochtli had been worshipped and where sacrifices were made to ensure the sun's journey. Now, after centuries of silence, the stones told a story, one that was lost but not forgotten. Every relic uncovered spoke to the devotion of the people. The carvings on the stone, the ceremonial offerings, the remnants of the warriors' battle gear, all pieces of a puzzle that had once been whole but had been shattered by time. The temple, like the city it stood in, had been swallowed by the earth. The Mexica's legacy had been buried, their gods silenced, their sacrifices forgotten. But the earth never forgets. One artifact caught the attention of a young archaeologist, a small figurine, so delicate in its craftsmanship, it seemed as if it might crumble with the slightest touch. It depicted a warrior, arms raised in triumph, wearing a feathered headdress that resembled the sun itself. The archaeologist could almost hear the chants of the warriors as they prepared for battle, their eyes locked on the figure of Huitzilopochtli as he guided them to victory. The figurine was a relic of a time when the Mexica had ruled, when their gods had walked among them, and when the sun had been their constant companion. The beauty of these artifacts was not just in their design but in the stories they told. Each piece was a whisper from the past, a message from those who had once lived, fought, and died in the name of the gods. It was as if the Mexica had left behind a part of themselves, an offering to those who would come after, so that they too might understand the depth of their devotion. But as the excavations continued, something more profound began to emerge. The Templo Mayor was not just a physical space, it was a reflection of the cosmos itself. The temple was aligned with the heavens, its structure designed to echo the sacred geometry of the universe. Every stone, every step, every carving had been placed with the utmost care, as though the Mexica had sought to bring the heavens down to earth. It was a testament to their understanding of the world, an understanding that transcended time, space, and even death. The Templo Mayor had been more than just a place of worship. It was the heart of the Mexica Empire, a symbol of their power, their spirituality, and their unshakable belief that their gods watched over them. But it was also a place of fear and sacrifice, a reminder that the sun's light, and the life it provided, had to be paid for. The priests, dressed in ceremonial robes, had stood at the altar, offering blood and life in exchange for the sun's continued presence. And now, thousands of miles away, the remnants of that sacred place were being uncovered, piece by piece, as if the earth itself was returning the offerings made so long ago. In the cool, still air of the excavation site, it was impossible not to feel the weight of history. The Mexica had built their empire on the belief that their gods were always with them, that the divine could be seen in the sun, in the moon, in the very earth beneath their feet. And as the artifacts were uncovered, it became clear, these people had not been forgotten. Their gods were still present, their spirits still lingered in the relics they had left behind. The Templo Mayor had been a place of immense significance, not just to the Mexica, but to the world. It was a symbol of the enduring power of belief, of devotion, and of the connection between humanity and the divine. Now, as the temple's secrets slowly emerged from the earth, it was clear that its legacy would never fade. The Mexica may have disappeared, but their gods, their stories, and their sacrifices would live on. And so, the archaeologists continued their work, their hands brushing against the cold stone, uncovering layer after layer of history. With each piece they uncovered, the temple came to life again, its walls echoing with the voices of those who had once prayed there. They had given everything for their gods. They had left their legacy in the stone, in the blood, in the offerings, and in the heart of the empire. And now, their story was being told once more. The Templo Mayor had stood as a beacon of light in a world that was constantly threatened by darkness. And now, centuries later, it still glowed with a light that refused to be extinguished. It was a reminder that the past, though buried, is never truly gone. It lingers in the earth, in the stones, in the relics, and in the hearts of those who remember. And perhaps, just perhaps, the sun still rises because they gave everything to ensure it would. The ground shifted with a faint tremor as the workers began their task. Beneath their feet, they could feel it, the weight of history, buried so long that even the air seemed to carry a heavy silence. It wasn't just the earth they were moving. They were uncovering something far more powerful, something that had once been sacred, a relic of divine battles fought in the heavens. Then, it appeared. At first, only a small corner, like a fragment of something ancient and heavy, but enough to send a ripple of excitement through the workers. They held their breath as the stone was carefully unearthed. And when it was fully revealed, it sent a wave of awe through every person there. The Coelzaqui stone. The famous, enigmatic stone. The moment it came into view, there was no mistaking its importance. There it was, etched in perfect detail, a vivid portrayal of a cosmic struggle that had happened long before any of the workers had been born, long before the city had crumbled. The image was sharp, its contours filled with energy. It depicted Coelzaqui, the moon goddess, her body twisted in agony, her head separated from her body, her limbs flung in every direction, a violent symbol of defeat. But what truly sent chills through the air was the figure standing above her, towering and unyielding, Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, the protector of the Mexica. The one who had fought and triumphed in the heavens. For a moment, there was complete stillness. The stone seemed to speak. The figures on its surface came alive, their ancient struggle rising out of the cold stone, the bloodshed of the gods echoing in the very air. The workers stood frozen, caught between worlds, between the past and the present. And for a fleeting instant, they could almost feel the weight of the sun's heat, the pulse of life flowing through their veins, the sacred duty of honoring a god who had battled for the very existence of the world. It wasn't just a stone. It was a message, a memory brought back to life. This wasn't simply art. It was a story carved in stone, a moment frozen in time, a battle that had shaped the course of the universe. The moon had been defeated. The sun had won. Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, had triumphed in a cosmic struggle, his victory ensuring the survival of the world, his presence forever etched into the fabric of time. The Coelzaqui stone was more than just a depiction of a divine battle, it was a symbol of the Mexica's belief in sacrifice, and bloodshed, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The moon goddess, Coelzaqui, had sought to destroy her brother, but Huitzilopochtli, armed with his divine power, had not only defeated her, but had torn her apart, scattering her remains across the sky. This violent imagery, this struggle between sibling gods, was a reflection of the constant battle the Mexica believed existed between opposing forces in the universe. As the stone was carefully examined, it became clear that it was not only a piece of art but a powerful representation of the Mexica worldview. The symbolism was rich and complex. It told of a world constantly on the edge of destruction, where the forces of light and dark were in eternal combat. But it was also a reminder that victory could only come through strength, through sacrifice, through the shedding of blood. It was a truth that resonated deeply with the Mexica people. They understood that to keep the sun rising each day, to keep the world turning, they had to honor their gods, to give of themselves. Each curve of the stone, each carving, seemed to pulse with the energy of the past. As the workers continued to examine it, they couldn't help but feel that they were standing on hallowed ground. The stone had been hidden away for centuries, but now, it was part of their world again. It had been buried for reasons unknown, left to lie in the earth until this moment. And as the sun hit the surface, the stone seemed to come alive with new purpose. It was as if the sun god had returned, his light once more casting its brilliance on the sacred object. The battle between Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl was no longer a forgotten tale, it was real again. But even more than that, the Quetzalcoatl stone was a testament to the Mexica's belief in their divine role. To them, the gods were not distant, abstract beings. They were part of their everyday lives. The stone was a reminder of their place in the grand cosmic order. It was their duty, their responsibility, to ensure that the gods were honored, that their victories were celebrated, and that the sun continued its journey across the sky. The stone, now resurrected, was not just an artifact, it was an invitation. An invitation to remember, to worship, to sacrifice. And so, as the archaeologists studied the stone, they began to piece together the stories of the past, stories that had long been silenced, buried beneath centuries of neglect. But now, the truth was coming to light once more. The Quetzalcoatl stone was a link to an ancient world, a world filled with divine battles, cosmic struggles, and the unyielding belief that the sun's journey could only continue with the shedding of blood. There was something profoundly moving about the rediscovery of the Quetzalcoatl stone. The stone wasn't just a symbol of a myth, it was a testament to the resilience of a people. The Mexica, though long gone, had left behind a legacy that was far more than mere artifacts. It was a legacy of strength, sacrifice, and an understanding of the eternal balance between light and dark. And as the workers stood over the stone, the significance of that moment washed over them. It wasn't just an excavation, it was a resurrection. And in the stillness of the excavation site, where the dust of centuries hung in the air, one could almost hear the sound of footsteps approaching, footsteps of those long gone, but never forgotten. The Mexica had left their mark on the earth. And now, with the rediscovery of the Quetzalcoatl stone, they were speaking once more. The sound of the war drums echoed through the valley, the steady rhythm vibrating through the very ground beneath their feet. The warriors, dressed in vibrant feathers and armor that caught the light of the sun, stood tall and silent, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Each heartbeat seemed to thump in time with the drums, each breath heavier than the last, as they prepared to march into battle. But for them, this was not just a fight. It was something sacred. It was an offering. To die in battle was to be reborn in the eyes of the gods. To shed one's blood in the name of Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, was to fulfill a divine calling. In that moment, as the warriors tightened their grips on their weapons, they weren't just preparing for war, they were answering a higher command. They were warriors of the sun, chosen to carry out the will of their god, Huitzilopochtli, who watched over them from the heavens above. Every step they took was a step closer to their destiny. Every arrow released from their bows, every strike of their swords, was more than a military tactic. It was an act of devotion, an offering of blood that would nourish the gods and ensure the sun's continued journey across the sky. The Mexica believed that the gods, especially Huitzilopochtli, needed the power of blood to remain strong, to fight against the forces of darkness that threatened to engulf the world. Without war, without sacrifice, the sun would not rise. For the warriors, there was no fear, no hesitation. Death was not an end, but a passage. To die in battle was to be claimed by Huitzilopochtli, to become part of his divine army, to live on as a star in the sky or a warrior in the gods' eternal service. The thought of dying in the service of Huitzilopochtli filled their hearts with pride and devotion. They were not just soldiers, they were sacred instruments of divine will. Each battle they fought was a prayer, each victory a testament to their unwavering faith. As the armies prepared to face one another, the soldiers knew that the outcome of the battle wasn't just about land or power. It was about the gods. It was about proving their worth in the eyes of Huitzilopochtli. The Mexica did not fight for personal glory. They fought for the gods, for the survival of the world, and for the promise that the sun would continue to rise each day. And so, as the war cries rang out and the first arrows flew through the air, they were not merely fighting against their enemies. They were fighting against the darkness, against the forces that would consume everything if left unchecked. To those who fought for Huitzilopochtli, the blood that was spilled on the battlefield was sacred. The earth itself seemed to tremble with each drop, as if the land knew it was being nourished by the divine. In the heat of battle, as the cries of the fallen mixed with the sound of clashing weapons, there was a sense that something greater was happening. The warriors were not merely individuals, they were part of a cosmic struggle, fighting to uphold the balance of the universe itself. The gods watched from above, and the warriors fought not only for themselves, but for all of creation. The warriors did not fear death. They welcomed it as a means to honor their god. The battlefield was a sacred space where life and death intertwined. It was a place where the Mexica warriors could prove their worthiness, their devotion to the sun god. To them, war was not something to be feared or avoided. It was something to be embraced, a means of showing the gods that they were worthy of protection and favor. And when the battle was over, the victorious warriors would return home, their hearts filled with the knowledge that they had given everything for the gods, that they had offered their blood to ensure the sun would rise again. This sacred duty extended beyond the battlefield. The priests, too, played their part in the great cosmic order. They were the intermediaries between the gods and the people, the ones who interpreted the will of Huitzilopochtli. They understood that the gods required sacrifice to maintain the balance of the universe, and it was their responsibility to ensure that the people's devotion was carried out. The warriors fought in battle, but the priests conducted the rituals that would make the blood offerings sacred. Together, they formed an unbreakable bond, each playing their part in the cosmic drama. The idea that war was a sacred duty was woven into the very fabric of Mexica society. Children grew up hearing the stories of Huitzilopochtli's great victories over darkness, learning that they, too, would one day have a part to play in this eternal struggle. The concept of sacrifice, of giving everything for the gods, was instilled in them from a young age. They were taught that the sun's journey across the sky was not guaranteed. It had to be fought for, defended, and renewed with each battle. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on the shoulders of every Mexican man, woman, and child. The sacrifices made in Huitzilopochtli's name were not just acts of violence, they were acts of faith. To shed blood, to offer life, was to ensure that the world would continue. The Mexica understood the importance of these sacrifices, and their warriors, their priests, their rulers, they all understood that they were part of something much greater than themselves. They were part of a divine cycle, a sacred duty that stretched beyond their own lifetimes, beyond their own desires. War, for the Mexica, was not an act of cruelty or conquest. It was an act of devotion, an offering of life to the gods. Every battle was a prayer. Every victory was a divine affirmation. And every death was a step closer to immortality in the service of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, the god of the sun. Through war, through sacrifice, they ensured that the sun would rise, that the world would continue, and that their devotion to the gods would never falter. It was a duty, sacred, powerful, and unwavering. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the warriors as they stood ready, poised for the battle that awaited them. The air was thick with the tension of the coming fight, the quiet before the storm. They were not just any warriors, they were the jaguar and eagle warriors, elites, chosen by the gods, bearing the weight of Huitzilopochtli's divine will. Dressed in the skins of jaguars, adorned with the feathers of eagles, and armed with weapons forged for destruction, they embodied the fierce, unyielding spirit of the animals they represented. The jaguar, known for its strength, stealth, and deadly speed, was the symbol of the warriors who struck with precision, who moved through the shadows like spirits of death. The eagle, soaring high above the earth, symbolized vision, strength, and courage. The eagle warriors were those who soared into battle with the heart of a predator, fearless and commanding. These warriors were the tip of the spear, the champions of Huitzilopochtli's cause. Their very existence was a testament to the gods' favor, and every battle they fought was a direct response to the divine call of their patron god. As they prepared to take the field, they were not just preparing for war, they were preparing to honor their god, to fight in the name of the sun, to strike at the forces of darkness and evil that threatened the world. The weight of the world seemed to rest upon their shoulders. The warriors who donned the jaguar and eagle insignia were not chosen by accident. Their training was grueling, their spirits tested in ways that only the fiercest warriors could endure. They were taught from the youngest age to fight with the precision of a jaguar stalking its prey and the courage of an eagle diving from the sky. They learned that war was not simply about victory over another tribe or gaining land, it was about fulfilling a sacred duty. To become a jaguar or eagle warrior was to be marked by the gods, to be entrusted with the responsibility of fighting not just for survival, but for the balance of the cosmos itself. As they stepped onto the battlefield, their hearts beat in rhythm with the drums that called them into action. There was no fear in their eyes, only the burning certainty that they were doing the work of the gods. The enemies they faced were not just adversaries, they were obstacles in the path of Huitzilopochtli's divine mission. Every swing of their obsidian blades, every strike with their spears, was an offering to their god. They were not merely soldiers. They were divine instruments, chosen to carry out the will of the sun god. The air crackled with energy as the battle began. The ground shook with the pounding of feet, the cries of warriors mixing with the clash of metal and the war cries that filled the sky. The jaguar warriors moved like shadows, silent and deadly, slipping between the chaos of the battle with ease, their movements fluid and precise. They stalked their enemies, striking when least expected, leaving death in their wake. There was no mercy in their eyes, only the cold, calculating focus of a hunter chasing its prey. The eagle warriors, on the other hand, were a storm. They charged into battle with an unrelenting fury, their weapons raised high, their cries echoing like thunder. They fought with the intensity of a predator, unafraid to face the enemy head-on. Their strength and courage were unmatched, and they soared through the battle with the pride of the eagle that gives no ground. Every swing of their sword, every blow struck with their mace, was a manifestation of Huitzilopochtli's power flowing through them. And all the while, above them, the sun burned brighter. The battle wasn't just between men, it was a cosmic struggle. Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, watched over them from the heavens, guiding their actions, fueling their strength. The warriors understood this deeply. The blood they spilled, the lives they took, were not merely for conquest, they were for the gods. The sacrifices made in battle were offerings to Huitzilopochtli, ensuring the continued rise of the sun and the balance of the universe. Each victory earned by the jaguar and eagle warriors was a triumph of divine will, a step toward the continuation of the world itself. They understood that their bravery on the battlefield wasn't just for themselves, it was for the people, for their families, for their empire. But most importantly, it was for Huitzilopochtli, the god who gave them the strength, the courage, and the will to fight. The battle raged on, and the jaguar and eagle warriors pushed forward, their eyes locked on the goal. The enemy may have been fierce, but they were nothing compared to the divine power that coursed through the warriors' veins. They fought not just to survive, but to ensure that Huitzilopochtli's light would shine brightly, that the sun would rise again tomorrow. They were not just fighting for victory. They were fighting for the eternal cycle of life and death, for the cosmic balance that governed all. At the end of the battle, when the dust settled and the ground was stained with the blood of fallen enemies and warriors alike, the jaguar and eagle warriors stood victorious. Their bodies were battered, their faces grim, but their spirits burned with the pride of knowing they had fulfilled their sacred duty. The sun, high in the sky, was a silent witness to their actions, a constant reminder of the power they had fought to protect. The sacrifices of the jaguar and eagle warriors were not forgotten. Their deeds lived on in the hearts of the Mexica people, their names etched into the annals of history. They were the chosen few, the warriors of Huitzilopochtli, who gave everything for the sun, for their god, and for the world itself. To fight as a jaguar or eagle warrior was to be part of something much greater than oneself. It was to carry the weight of the universe on one's shoulders and to honor the sacred duty entrusted by the gods. In every battle they fought, the jaguar and eagle warriors stood as symbols of devotion, strength, and divine purpose. They were the shining light in the darkness, the ones who held back the shadows, and in their hearts, they knew their God would never let them fall. In a dusty corner of a forgotten library, a scholar's hand brushes over the delicate surface of a codex, its ancient pages weathered and fragile with age. The flickering light of a single candle casts shadows across the room, illuminating the intricate illustrations that seem to pulse with life. Each stroke of the brush, each symbol, tells a story, a myth, a prayer to the gods. Among them, one figure stands tall, a warrior holding the sun itself, Huitzilopochtli. These are the codices, the lifeblood of Aztec history. They are more than just pages, they are windows into the past, telling stories of divine battles, sacrifices, and the unyielding will of a people. In the scribbled lines of these sacred texts, the myth of Huitzilopochtli rises like the sun itself, guiding us through time. Each codex is a testament to the devotion of the Mexica people, who painstakingly recorded the will of their gods through their art and writing. These images are not just decoration, they are sacred messages, each symbol carrying weight and meaning far beyond the ink on the page. Every curve, every line, tells the story of a battle that spans centuries, one between light and darkness, life and death. Huitzilopochtli is not just a god to these people, he is their protector, their guiding force. His presence, immortalized in codices and chronicles, is woven into the very fabric of their lives. One such codex tells the story of Huitzilopochtli's birth, a tale of blood and fire. The sky split open as the god emerged, fully grown, with a serpent-like weapon in hand, ready to wage war against the forces of darkness. The artistry in the codex is overwhelming. The serpent twists and curls in an eternal dance, its teeth bared in a perpetual snarl. Huitzilopochtli stands in the center, his face fierce, his body a beacon of power. He is the sun incarnate, blazing through the heavens, defeating the night. But it's not just the image that captures the viewer's heart, it's the sense of urgency and devotion that radiates from the page. Another page of the codex depicts the celestial battle, Huitzilopochtli against his sister, Coyolxauhqui, whose dismembered body is scattered across the sky after her defeat. The symbols are sharp and raw, mirroring the violence of the clash. The stones of the Templo Mayor, once drenched in the blood of sacrifices, echo the same violent tension. These codices are not merely artistic renderings, they are prayers, sacrifices made in ink and paint, honoring the gods and their eternal struggle to maintain order in the universe. But beyond the vivid imagery lies a deeper, more poignant truth. These codices reveal a people who lived in constant reverence of their gods. The rituals, the sacrifices, the wars, all were seen through the lens of devotion. The Mexica didn't fight for territory alone, they fought to keep the sun rising. Each battle was not just a conquest, it was an act of faith. Each warrior who fell in battle was a martyr, a soul sent to join Huitzilopochtli in his eternal war against darkness. The codices tell of these sacrifices in heartbreaking detail, where the heart, the most sacred of all offerings, is torn from the chest of the fallen. The sun can only continue to shine if blood is spilled in its honor. This was the truth of the Mexica world, one of endless cycles, of life and death, of creation and destruction. One codex reveals a particularly striking moment in the battle between Huitzilopochtli and the forces of darkness. The god's figure towers above the battlefield, a shining light amidst the chaos. His warriors, symbols of jaguars and eagles, stand by his side, their expressions fierce, determined, ready to fight. The god's enemies, night, shadows, and destruction, loom in the background, but they are no match for Huitzilopochtli's divine will. As you look closer, you can almost hear the war drums beating, the battle cries rising in unison with the sun's eternal flame. The codices are not static, they are alive with the energy of the past. Each image, though frozen in time, seems to move, as if the divine power of the gods still courses through the ink and paper. One can feel the weight of the warrior's sword, the intensity in the god's eyes, and the fierce pulse of life that binds them all together. These were not just stories, they were instructions, commandments handed down from the heavens. The Mexica believed that by recording these divine moments, they could ensure their place in the sun's eternal journey. The chronicles, written alongside these codices, provide the context that gives voice to the images. They speak of the sacrifices made by the people to ensure the survival of their world. They recount the ceremonies where warriors, priests, and kings gathered to honor Huitzilopochtli, offering their prayers and their blood. The words are simple but heavy, each one laden with the knowledge that these were not just ceremonial acts, they were life-sustaining. In these texts, the Mexica sought not just to immortalize the gods, but to teach future generations the importance of their faith. The codices and chronicles are educational tools, designed to instill a deep respect for Huitzilopochtli, to remind the people of their sacred duty. The gods were not distant, unreachable figures. They were present in every battle, every sacrifice, every day the sun rose in the sky. There's something profoundly moving about the way these texts capture the essence of life. The Mexica didn't just document their history, they recorded their relationship with the divine. The gods were as real to them as the earth beneath their feet, the sky above their heads. And in return, Huitzilopochtli's mythos became the heart of their empire. The images told of his power, his victory, and his promise to protect those who followed him. Every page of the codices holds the heartbeat of a civilization. They carry the weight of centuries of tradition, sacrifice, and devotion. And as the scholar's fingers trace the ancient lines, there's a sense that the past is not truly gone. It lives on in the images, in the words, in the spirit of those who believed in Huitzilopochtli's eternal light. In these chronicles, you can hear the thundering drums, the roar of the eagles, and the cry of the jaguars. You can feel the sweat of the warriors and the heat of the sun on their backs. And you can understand, just for a moment, what it was like to stand in the shadow of a god who watched over you, who guided your every step, and whose light you fought to protect with all the strength of your heart. The sun sets over a battlefield, casting its fiery glow across the land, a promise of victory. As the rays stretch across the earth, warriors stand firm, their weapons gleaming with the light of the heavens. These are no ordinary weapons, no mere tools of war. In their hands are the Huitzilopochtli, swords with sharp obsidian blades embedded in wood, mirroring the very weapon of Huitzilopochtli, the sun god. These warriors are not just fighting for land or pride. They are fighting for the sun, for the god who shines above them, for the sacred duty to honor Huitzilopochtli. The Huitzilopochtli is not simply a weapon, it is an extension of divine will. It is a sacred tool, crafted with the utmost reverence and precision, meant to channel the god's power and fury. Each time the blade slashes through the air, it is as though Huitzilopochtli himself is cutting through the darkness, banishing the night with the fire of his light. The warriors who wield these sacred weapons are more than just soldiers, they are chosen, anointed to carry out the will of the god. They are the living extension of the sun god's rage and protection, and the Huitzilopochtli is their bond to that power. The blade itself is a masterpiece, each obsidian shard, sharp enough to slice through flesh, carefully shaped and inserted into the wooden frame with reverence. The Huitzilopochtli is a deadly weapon, but it is also a symbol of strength, of Huitzilopochtli's enduring influence in the physical world. The obsidian edges catch the light of the sun, reflecting it back into the eyes of the enemy, blinding them, just as the sun blinds those who try to challenge it. It is a weapon made for the divine, a reflection of Huitzilopochtli's own fiery wrath, and it commands awe and fear. To hold the Huitzilopochtli is to hold the power of the sun itself. As the warrior grips the hilt, they feel the weight of centuries of tradition. They are not just individuals, they are part of something far greater. The heat from the blade, the sharpness of the obsidian, the strength of the wood, it is all imbued with the spirit of Huitzilopochtli. The warrior is not fighting just for honor or glory, but for the light that gives life to all. In their hands, the Huitzilopochtli becomes a force of nature, an instrument of divine justice, ready to strike down the forces of darkness that threaten to eclipse the sun. Every time a warrior swings their weapon, they are invoking the power of Huitzilopochtli, sending his fury into the heart of their enemies. The warriors know this. They know that the Huitzilopochtli is more than just a tool, it is an extension of the sun god's will. It is a weapon forged not just in the heat of the forge, but in the sacred fires of faith and devotion. The blade is a bridge between the mortal world and the divine, and those who wield it are chosen to carry out the will of the gods themselves. The battlefield becomes a sacred space, a place where the struggle between light and darkness is fought with every strike of the Huitzilopochtli. The warriors' hearts beat in rhythm with the sun, their movements precise, their focus unyielding. Each swing of the weapon is a prayer, a plea for the sun to rise again, to burn away the night and bring forth the dawn. The Huitzilopochtli is the weapon of sacrifice, a tool used to honor the gods, to spill blood that will keep the sun shining. In the heat of battle, the line between the sacred and the earthly disappears. There is no separation. The gods are with the warriors, guiding their strikes, giving them strength. But the Huitzilopochtli is not the only weapon that embodies the power of the sun god. The warriors also carry shields, adorned with images of the sun, blazing with the same fiery light that courses through the veins of Huitzilopochtli. These shields are not just tools of defense, they are symbols of divine protection. They are meant to reflect the light of the sun, to shield the warriors from harm, just as Huitzilopochtli himself shields his followers from the darkness. To the warriors, the Huitzilopochtli is not just a weapon, it is a promise. It is the promise of the sun's eternal power, a promise that each battle fought in Huitzilopochtli's name will bring them closer to the divine. The warriors are not just fighting for themselves, they are fighting for the future, for the sun that will rise again. And in their hands, the weapons become more than instruments of death, they become tools of creation, of life, of light. Each warrior who takes up the Huitzilopochtli knows the weight of their duty. They are not just soldiers, they are warriors chosen by the gods to carry out a sacred task. The Huitzilopochtli is a symbol of that responsibility. It is a weapon that carries the power of the sun god, but it also carries the burden of the sun's eternal struggle against darkness. The warriors' victories are not just personal triumphs, they are victories for the light, for the world itself. In the quiet moments before the battle, when the warriors stand ready, their weapons gleaming in the sun's light, there is a sense of reverence, a silent prayer for the strength to carry out their duty. They are not alone in their fight. They are connected to something far greater than themselves. With each swing of the Huitzilopochtli, they feel the presence of Huitzilopochtli at their side, guiding their hand, giving them strength. The weapon is not just an object, it is a channel for the divine, a vessel for the sun god's power. As the battle rages on, the warriors fight with a fury that is both earthly and divine. The Huitzilopochtli becomes an extension of their will, a reflection of the sun god's light cutting through the darkness. With every strike, they are not just defeating enemies, they are affirming their faith in Huitzilopochtli, ensuring that the sun will rise again, that the world will continue to turn in the light of the god's eternal fire. In the end, the Huitzilopochtli is more than a weapon, it is a symbol of devotion, of sacrifice, and of the unyielding power of the sun. It is the weapon of a people who understood that war, like the sun, is a sacred duty, a divine act that must be carried out with honor, courage, and the knowledge that the light of Huitzilopochtli will always shine through. And for those who wield the Huitzilopochtli, there is no greater honor than to fight in the name of the sun god, to carry his power into battle and ensure that his light will never fade. The beating of drums echoes through the air, a powerful, rhythmic sound that reverberates in the hearts of the warriors. The air smells of earth, sweat, and anticipation. The sun rises higher, casting its golden rays over the field of battle, illuminating the faces of the soldiers ready to fight in the name of Huitzilopochtli. They are not just soldiers, they are disciples, ready to carry out the sacred will of the sun god. The battlefield stretches out before them, a sea of enemies waiting to be struck down. But the Aztec warriors are calm, their faces stern with resolve. They have no fear. They know that the god of war, the god of the sun, is with them. Huitzilopochtli has blessed them, given them the power to strike down their enemies and expand their empire. Under his banner, they will bring light to the world, and no one can stand against the might of the sun god. Their tactics are not random or impulsive. Every move is calculated, every formation is deliberate, and each strike is guided by the divine. The Aztec warriors, united under the banner of Huitzilopochtli, are a formidable force. They don't just fight, they fight with purpose, with strategy. Every battle is a reflection of the god's divine will, and every victory is a testament to his strength. The warriors move as one, a single unit, each knowing their place, each knowing their role in the grand scheme of things. Their tactics are simple, but deadly. They use surprise, ambush, and speed to overwhelm their enemies. They are like a swarm of locusts, descending upon their foes with precision, striking quickly and then retreating before the enemy has time to react. It's not just about strength, it's about intelligence, about knowing when to attack and when to pull back, when to push forward and when to hold your ground. They strike hard and fast, using the terrain to their advantage. The mountains, the valleys, the forests, everything becomes part of their battlefield. They don't just fight where the battle is. They fight where the battle will be won. They set traps, lay ambushes, and wait in silence, knowing that their enemies will fall into their hands. The Aztec warriors are experts in guerrilla warfare, masters of deception and surprise. They are swift and ruthless, like the sun god himself. Every battle fought under the banner of Huitzilopochtli is a spiritual act. The Aztec warriors see themselves as instruments of the divine, chosen to carry out the will of the sun god. When they march into battle, they do not march as mere soldiers. They march as priests, as sacred agents of light, sent to destroy the darkness. Their weapons are not just tools of war. They are instruments of divine power, channeling the fury of Huitzilopochtli. And with every strike, every kill, they honor their god. They are warriors, yes, but they are also builders. Each victory, each conquest, adds another piece to the great mosaic of their empire. Their wars are not just about bloodshed, they are about the future, about ensuring the survival of their people, and above all, about honoring the god who gives them the strength to fight. Huitzilopochtli is their protector, their guide, and their source of power. With every victory, the Aztec Empire grows, the light of Huitzilopochtli expanding to new lands. But even in victory, there is no sense of complacency. The Aztecs know that the war will never end. The sun must always rise, the light must always shine. And so, the warriors march on, ever ready to fight in the name of the god. Their tactics, their discipline, their unyielding belief in their cause, these are the keys to their success. They fight as one, bound together by a single purpose, to honor Huitzilopochtli and ensure that the sun continues to shine. The battlefield is not just a place of violence. It is a sacred space, a place where the warriors can prove their devotion to the sun god. In the heat of battle, they feel his presence with them. Every swing of their macuahuitl, every thrust of their spear, is an offering to him. Their bloodied hands are not a sign of cruelty, but of sacrifice. They fight not for glory, but for the god who gives them the power to fight. As the enemy falls before them, the Aztec warriors feel a surge of triumph. It is not just victory, they know it is Huitzilopochtli's victory. They have honored him, and in return, he has blessed them with strength and courage. They do not see themselves as conquerors. They see themselves as instruments of divine will, chosen to carry out a sacred mission. They do not fight for wealth or power. They fight to ensure that the sun will never set, that Huitzilopochtli's light will never be extinguished. The tactics of the Aztecs are a reflection of their unwavering faith. Every movement, every maneuver is guided by their belief that they are fighting for something greater than themselves. They are fighting for the survival of their people, for the triumph of light over darkness. They are fighting to ensure that Huitzilopochtli's reign will never end, that his power will never fade. And as the sun begins to set on the battlefield, the Aztec warriors stand victorious, their enemies broken, their mission complete. The light of Huitzilopochtli shines down upon them, a promise that their work is not done, that the fight will continue. But for now, they can rest, knowing that they have honored their god, that they have fought with all their strength, and that the sun will rise again tomorrow, as it always has. The Aztec military tactics were not just about winning battles. They were about the very essence of their faith. War was not just a duty, it was a sacred act, a divine mission to ensure that the sun would always shine. And in every battle fought under the banner of Huitzilopochtli, the warriors proved their devotion, their courage, and their unshakable belief in the light that guided them. The flicker of distant fires lit up the horizon, and the watchers on the stone walls of Tenochtitlan stood in silence, their eyes narrowing at the faint glow. Far beyond the lake, past the mountains and valleys, rival cities gathered in the dark, whispering among themselves. To them, Huitzilopochtli was not just a god, he was a shadow looming over their lands, the symbol of an empire that stretched farther with each passing season. They had heard the stories. Some whispered that the sun god drank the hearts of warriors, that the walls of Tenochtitlan pulsed with the lifeblood of those who dared to resist. Others spoke of him as a golden eagle, circling above the empire, watching with eyes that pierced through stone and forest. To the enemy, Huitzilopochtli's gaze was relentless. He was not a distant myth, but a force that moved in lockstep with the armies of the Aztec Empire, a force that could not be ignored. Cities trembled at the sound of the drums, knowing that once they began, they did not stop until tribute was paid or blood soaked the ground. But fear was not the only thing that filled the hearts of rival leaders. Envy crept alongside it, a sharp blade hidden beneath polite exchanges of gifts and envoys. The Aztecs had turned war into devotion, battle into prayer. How could the gods of smaller cities compete with a deity who demanded sacrifice on such a scale? Alliances were fragile. Leaders would swear loyalty in the golden halls of Tenochtitlan, but as they stepped outside the capital, their minds raced with betrayal. To them, Huitzilopochtli's favor was not a blessing, it was a noose tightening around their necks. One misstep, one failed harvest, and the Aztecs would march. There was no room for weakness beneath the sun. Even so, there were those who admired the sun god, seeking to bend his favor to their will. Smaller city-states watched with hungry eyes, hoping that by offering warriors and gifts, they might share in his strength. They dressed their soldiers in bright feathers and painted their faces with the same blue reserved for sacrifices, hoping Huitzilopochtli would see them not as enemies but as brothers in arms. But the Aztecs knew the difference. They could see it in the way foreign warriors held their spears, how their hands trembled when the jaguar-clad warriors of Tenochtitlan arrived at the gates. A borrowed devotion was not the same as the fire that burned in the hearts of those born under the sun's watchful eye. Huitzilopochtli was not a god to be borrowed. He was either worshipped with the fullness of one's spirit or feared from afar. War was inevitable. Rival states sought to rise, but every step forward brought them closer to the flames. They plotted, gathering allies, thinking they could stand against the power of the sun god. In hidden chambers, they made plans, drawing maps with shaking hands, hoping that numbers alone could darken the sky above Tenochtitlan. But Huitzilopochtli's warriors welcomed the challenge. When the warriors of the empire marched, they did not speak of conquest. They carried the weight of the sun on their backs, moving not for wealth or land, but to ensure that light would continue to shine over the empire. In their minds, every city that resisted was not just an enemy, it was a threat to the balance of the world itself. And so the wars continued, year after year, as city after city was pulled beneath the shadow of the eagle. Some bent the knee willingly, offering their sons and daughters to the altars of Tenochtitlan, hoping to stave off destruction. Others fought to the last breath, knowing their defiance would only fuel the stories told by Aztec priests. Yet there was an understanding that lived between the battles, an unspoken bond. Even the fiercest rivals knew that without Huitzilopochtli, the sun might not rise tomorrow. The Aztecs fought not for destruction but for balance, for the eternal turning of the sun and the survival of all beneath its warmth. In their victories, enemies saw not just conquest but the inevitable rise of light over shadow. And still, the fires burned in the distance, flickering like ghosts on the horizon. The watchers on the walls of Tenochtitlan never looked away. They knew that somewhere beyond the mountains, another city whispered in the dark, thinking that this time would be different, that this time Huitzilopochtli would not see them coming. But he always did. The sun rose over Tenochtitlan with the weight of 1,000 promises. Golden light spilled across the temple steps, where priests whispered ancient words, their hands trembling over blades that glinted in the morning haze. In the hearts of the people, the dawn was more than the arrival of a new day. It was proof that Huitzilopochtli had prevailed once again, carrying the sun on his back through the endless sky. Each morning was a battle won. Each evening, a reminder that the war never ended. The empire stretched far, but not far enough. In the distance, unseen lands lay hidden beneath the shadows of foreign gods, their names barely spoken aloud in Tenochtitlan. To the Aztecs, those lands were unfinished stories, waiting for Huitzilopochtli's fire to shape them. It wasn't greed that pulled them toward distant cities or the promise of wealth. It was something older, something whispered in the cracks of stone monuments and written in blood on temple walls. Long ago, when the world was young and the stars hung low, Huitzilopochtli had fought his own brothers and sisters, carving the heavens with their bones. The battle was not born of hatred but necessity. Light could not exist without the fall of darkness. To the Aztecs, conquest was not a choice. It was the fulfillment of that ancient war, the echo of divine footsteps pressing against the earth. Every campaign began the same way. Warriors did not simply sharpen their weapons, they listened to the stories, handed down from the mouths of the elders, told with the same reverence as sacred prayers. They heard of how the sun god had faced the jealous moon goddess Huitzilopochtli, how she had rallied the stars to strike him down before his birth. But he rose anyway, armed with the feathered serpent's flame, scattering his enemies with the fury of the heavens. It was more than myth. It was a map, traced into the very landscape of the empire. Each enemy city was a star in the night sky, and every battle was another step in Huitzilopochtli's endless march. The warriors were not just men, they were the continuation of the god's arm, wielding his will through stone and fire. To deny conquest would have been to deny the sun itself, to let the world slip slowly into shadow. Cities on the edge of the empire understood this well. They saw the jaguar warriors arrive at their gates not as invaders, but as the inevitable weight of destiny pressing down upon them. Those who fought were not seen as traitors, but as part of the story, playing their role in a myth written long before their birth. Even the fiercest resistance became part of the cycle, feeding the empire's momentum. The priests reminded the warriors that hesitation was dangerous. In Huitzilopochtli's myth, Huitzilopochtli had underestimated him for a single breath, and in that breath, she had fallen, her body shattered across the mountain. So too could cities crumble if they lingered on doubt or mercy. The sun did not wait for those who stood in its path. The soldiers carried this belief in their bones. When they marched beneath the banners of the empire, they moved with the weight of something greater than themselves. Their shields bore the image of the sun, not as decoration but as a warning to all who saw them on the horizon. Each step was heavy with the knowledge that they walked alongside gods. There was a quiet understanding, even among the people, that the expansion of the empire was not the pursuit of power but survival. The myths told of worlds that had risen and fallen before this one, devoured by stars that hungered for the sun's warmth. To let the empire stop growing was to risk inviting that hunger, to let the shadows curl around the edges of Tenochtitlan until even the heart of the capital flickered and went out. And so, the warriors pressed forward. They crossed rivers and valleys, climbed jagged peaks where foreign gods slept beneath stone temples. At every conquest, the priests lifted their arms to the sky, thanking Huitzilopochtli not for the victory itself, but for the chance to continue the fight. The myth lived in every corner of the empire, carved into the stones of pyramids, painted on the inside of homes where even children whispered it to one another before sleep. They grew up knowing that to hold a blade was to hold the sun itself, that to march in the name of the empire was to retrace the steps of Huitzilopochtli's eternal war. But the story did not end with battle. The fallen were carried back to Tenochtitlan with honor, their bodies draped in bright feathers and obsidian. Their names were added to the chants of the priests, joining the myth as heroes who had fed the sun with their lives. There was no shame in death, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had fulfilled the will of the gods. And still, the sun rose, heavy with the promise of more to come. The people of Tenochtitlan gazed at the horizon, knowing that somewhere, beneath the shadows of distant mountains, new stars waited to be pulled from the sky. The march of Huitzilopochtli continued, not out of conquest, but because the world demanded it. To stop was to fade. In the quiet, beneath the morning light, the fires on the temple steps flickered, their smoke curling into the sky. Somewhere, the drums began to echo, steady as the heartbeat of the empire, calling warriors to gather once more. The valley stretched before them, quiet and still, but the air carried something electric, something that prickled at the edges of the warriors' senses. They stood at the crest of the hill, jaguar skins draped over their backs, the feathers of eagles shimmering in the morning light. Tenochtitlan lay far behind, but they could feel its pulse, steady as the drums that echoed faintly in the distance. This was not just another battle. This was the will of Huitzilopochtli pressing down upon their shoulders, guiding their steps as surely as the wind carved paths through the mountains. Below, the enemy moved, small and shadowed against the rising sun. Their banners rippled like restless serpents, and the faint glint of obsidian weapons caught the light. The warriors of Tenochtitlan had fought many like them before, cities that had resisted, not out of defiance, but out of fear. The Aztecs did not march to crush. They marched because the sun demanded it. Every clash, every conquest, was a piece of the great story unfolding, one that began long before these cities had names and would continue long after their stones crumbled into dust. The priests had spoken of this battle the night before. Standing over the fires, they called to Huitzilopochtli, their voices rising with the smoke as they traced the path the warriors would take. It was not strategy or tactics they offered, it was prophecy. The sun god had already seen this battle play out. The warriors were simply following in his footsteps, as inevitable as the dawn chasing away the night. The first to step forward were the eagle warriors, their faces painted with the fierce beak of the sun's messengers. They moved silently, eyes locked ahead, each breath steady. Behind them, the jaguar warriors crouched low, the painted rosettes on their skin blending into the brush, shadows of the great predators they embodied. Together, they descended into the valley, each step carrying the weight of something larger than themselves. The enemy watched them come, and for a moment, the valley held its breath. There was no grand cry to signal the start. The air itself seemed to crack, and then the warriors surged forward, obsidian blades flashing, shields catching the light like mirrors reflecting the fire of the sun. The clash was thunderous, the echo rolling across the hills. Every strike, every fall of a spear, felt like the beat of a drum. The warriors fought not with rage, but with certainty. They did not swing wildly or waste their strength. Each movement was precise, each thrust an offering to Huitzilopochtli, as if the god himself fought beside them. The enemy held for a time, their lines shifting and bending like reeds in the wind. They were fierce, but there was something in the eyes of the Aztec warriors that could not be matched. It was not hatred that drove them forward, it was devotion. They were not fighting for land or gold. They were fighting to keep the sun in the sky. As the sun climbed higher, the enemy began to break. The banners that had once danced proudly now wilted, their bearers sinking to their knees. The Aztec warriors pressed on, not out of cruelty, but because the battle had not yet given its final breath. The priests had said the valley would yield, and so it did. By the time the last blade lowered, the valley was silent again. Smoke curled from the torches, rising into the sky as the priests stepped forward, their robes heavy with the scent of burning incense. The warriors did not cheer. They did not lift their arms in triumph. They stood still, gazing across the field as if waiting for something unseen. The priests whispered prayers, thanking Huitzilopochtli for his guidance, for the strength he had given their arms. The fallen were gathered with care, their names spoken softly as they were laid upon woven mats. They would be remembered, not as enemies, but as part of the great cycle, their lives given to fuel the rising sun. That night, as the fires burned low and the stars blinked into view, the warriors sat together, listening to the priests once more. The story of the battle was already being told, etched into the memories of those who survived. This valley, like the many before it, had become part of the myth. Huitzilopochtli's war continued, his light stretching further with each victory. But even as the priests spoke, the warriors could feel it, the weight of the next battle already forming on the horizon. Huitzilopochtli's footsteps never paused, and neither would theirs. The first steps were always the heaviest. The weight wasn't in the body, but in the heart, a pull that reached deep into the chest and held there. Every pilgrim felt it, that unshakable sense of stepping into something far greater than themselves. The road stretched ahead, winding through hills and valleys, each twist and turn mirroring the paths once walked by the gods. At the front, the priests moved in silence, their faces hidden beneath intricate headdresses adorned with hummingbird feathers, the sacred symbol of Huitzilopochtli. The feathers quivered lightly in the wind, as if they carried the whispers of the god himself. Behind them, the warriors marched in solemn lines, their eyes fixed ahead, sharp and steady. Among them walked farmers, artisans, and children, none exempt from this sacred path. The land itself seemed to recognize the weight of the procession. Trees bent slightly, casting long shadows over the narrow paths. Birds, usually loud and restless, perched silently as the procession passed below. Each step felt measured, almost rehearsed, though no one had practiced this walk. It was as if the ground remembered, guiding their feet to the places where Huitzilopochtli's presence lingered strongest. When the first shrine appeared at the base of a hill, there was no command given, no signal shouted. As if bound by one shared breath, the pilgrims knelt. The air smelled of damp earth and copal smoke drifting lazily from clay burners. The priest stepped forward, hands raised, and murmured prayers into the sky. For a moment, the world held still, the only sound the flicker of the flames. The shrine was small, weathered by time, but the carved face of Huitzilopochtli remained sharp. His eyes, chiseled into the stone, seemed to watch each pilgrim as they passed, marking them as his own. One by one, offerings were laid at his feet, turquoise beads, woven cloth, and small figurines shaped from obsidian. Simple things, yet each carried the weight of sacrifice. The march continued, winding higher into the hills. Each shrine marked another layer of the god story. Here, the priests whispered, was where he battled his sister Quetzalcoatl. Further ahead, at the summit, stood the stone where his heart had first touched the earth, blazing with the fire of the sun. The march was not just about honoring Huitzilopochtli's victories, but reliving them, step by step, as if the land itself remembered the heat of those ancient battles. As the sun dipped lower, the light began to soften, casting long streaks of gold across the landscape. By this time, the procession had grown quieter. The younger pilgrims, once restless and eager, now walked with heads bowed, feeling the weight that pressed upon them. Even the warriors, hardened by countless battles, seemed to carry a softer gaze as they approached the next shrine. There was something unexplainable in those moments, something that sank into the bones. The shrines were not just stones placed along the path. They felt alive, pulsing gently with the heart of Huitzilopochtli himself. At the highest point of the pilgrimage, the great altar stood, carved into the face of a cliff that overlooked the valley. From here, the entire land stretched out beneath the pilgrims, a vast expanse of rivers and fields glowing under the final light of day. The priests gathered close to the edge, lifting their arms to the horizon as the warriors stood guard behind them, silent and still as statues. The prayers spoken at this altar were different, softer, almost like lullabies. The priests did not ask for victory or strength. They thanked Huitzilopochtli for his warmth, for his fire, and for the light that guided their path. Behind them, the pilgrims lay small offerings along the altar's base, flowers, maize, even strands of hair carefully cut and placed by trembling hands. It wasn't the value of the offering that mattered, but the act of giving something that carried meaning. As the last offering was laid down, the sky shifted. Stars began to blink softly above, and the valley below disappeared into shadow. But standing at that altar, the pilgrims felt no fear. The stars above were the eyes of the gods, and the path behind them glowed faintly, as if illuminated by Huitzilopochtli's lingering touch. Long after the priests extinguished the torches, the pilgrims remained. They sat quietly, gazing at the stars, feeling the hum of the land beneath them. They knew that come morning, they would descend from the hills, return to their homes, and resume the lives they had left behind. But something had shifted, something that could not be undone. The march was more than a ritual. It was a reminder. Each step echoed the battles Huitzilopochtli fought, the sacrifices he made to hold the sun aloft. And as long as they walked this path, as long as their feet touched the earth where he once stood, the sun would rise again. Far beyond the hills, the city waited. The great temple loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching across the land. And beneath that shadow, warriors sharpened their blades, preparing for the battles to come. Huitzilopochtli's will did not rest, and neither did those who walked in his name. The banners did not move the way they once did. The wind, usually sharp and eager to carry them high, barely stirred their edges. Warriors stood in neat rows, their faces set in stone, but something was missing. It wasn't their armor or weapons, they still gleamed beneath the sun, polished and ready. It was the way they held themselves, the flicker of fire in their eyes. It had dimmed. In the heart of the square, the high priest raised his hands toward the heavens, calling out to Huitzilopochtli. His voice echoed off the temple steps, loud and firm, but it felt thin against the sky. The crowd watched, silent and expectant, as if waiting for something unseen to stir. Their god had never failed them before. The sun had always risen, and the empire had always grown stronger under his watch. But the signs had begun to change. Whispers crept through the streets like mist curling around stone. The harvests had grown lean, the rains more unpredictable. Enemies that once cowered in the distance now gathered at the edges of the valley. In the quiet of the night, mothers pressed their children close, murmuring prayers that felt heavier than they used to. The weight of the empire hung over them all, and with each passing day, it seemed harder to bear. When the first battle faltered, it was brushed aside. A misstep, nothing more. But as the months stretched on, the cracks grew wider. Warriors returned with fewer captives. The temples saw fewer offerings. And at the edge of the great plaza, the statue of Huitzilopochtli seemed to watch with unblinking eyes, his stone face unreadable. The elders remembered the stories passed down by their ancestors, the warnings etched into codices and whispered by firelight. Huitzilopochtli's favor was not eternal. He was a god of strength, but strength demanded sacrifice. When the people faltered, so did his light. On the eve of another campaign, the streets filled with the sound of drums. Warriors marched beneath the moon, shadows stretching long across the city walls. Their faces were painted in bright reds and blacks, but even the boldest among them glanced nervously at the horizon. Somewhere out there, the enemy gathered, emboldened by the empire's hesitation. The priests led the procession to the temple steps, where the fires burned low. Offerings were laid at Huitzilopochtli's feet, flowers, jewels, and the blood of those chosen for sacrifice. But the flames did not rise as they once did. The smoke curled listlessly into the air, and the silence that followed felt louder than the drums. When the sun rose the next morning, its light seemed thinner, struggling to break through the gray veil hanging over the city. As the warriors marched to war, they could not shake the feeling that something was missing. The wind against their backs felt cold. The battle that followed was unlike any they had faced before. The enemy came with greater force, their weapons sharper, their lines unbroken. The Aztec warriors fought bravely, but each strike felt heavier, each movement slower. Huitzilopochtli's fire had always guided them, but now it flickered like a candle too far from the wick. One by one, the standards fell. The enemy pushed forward, and the banners of the empire sank into the mud. The great captains called out to Huitzilopochtli, raising their spears high, but no answer came. By nightfall, the survivors limped back through the city gates, their eyes hollow and their arms empty. The temple steps that once shone with the promise of victory stood cold and silent. The god's gaze still bore down upon them, but it no longer felt warm. In the weeks that followed, the city seemed to shrink. The streets were quieter, and the air felt thick with something unspoken. The people gathered at the temples, laying what little they could at Huitzilopochtli's feet, but the weight of doubt pressed hard against their shoulders. The elders spoke in hushed tones of ancient days, of empires that rose and fell beneath the gaze of the gods. They knew what this meant, though few dared to say it aloud. Huitzilopochtli's favor had begun to wane, and with it, the empire's light began to flicker. Still, the priests stood tall, their voices unwavering as they led the people in prayer. Beneath their steady hands, the fires continued to burn, faint but unbroken. They knew the cycle well, what was lost could yet be reclaimed. Far beyond the city walls, and the quiet hills where the shrines of old lay nestled among the trees, the first pilgrims had already begun their march. The path was long, but they walked with steady steps, their offerings clutched tightly in their hands. Somewhere along that winding road, the heart of Huitzilopochtli still beat, waiting to be found once more. The first ships didn't seem real. Their sails loomed on the horizon like ghostly wings, gliding across the waters of the eastern shore. From the heights of Tenochtitlan, the watchers squinted against the sun, uncertain if the shapes cutting through the dawn mist were messengers from the gods or omens of something else. In the streets below, the city moved as it always had, children laughing, merchants calling out their wares, priests tending to the flames on temple altars. But a ripple of unease twisted beneath the surface, a current that grew stronger with every new word carried from the coast. Strangers had come, their skin pale as bone and their eyes hard like flint. They brought weapons that roared like thunder and beasts that shook the ground with their steps. The priests gathered at the temple of Huitzilopochtli, pressing their foreheads to the stone, begging for guidance. Had this been foretold? Was this the dawn of war or the hour of reckoning? When the Spaniards crossed into the valley, the sun sat heavy and low in the sky. The emperor watched from the heights of his palace, his robes gleaming with gold that reflected the fading light. The streets below whispered with the sound of thousands, all waiting, all watching. The warriors painted their faces, their chests bare and proud, hearts steady but filled with questions they dared not speak aloud. Huitzilopochtli had always been the god of war, the shield that guarded the empire's heart. His spirit burned in the center of every warrior, his name shouted in every charge. But as the enemy marched forward, clad in steel and carrying crosses, the air trembled with something unfamiliar. On the steps of the Templo Mayor, the priests raised their arms, calling for the sun god to rise, to blind those who would trespass against his city. Blood flowed down the steps in red rivers, sacrifices given freely, each cut of the blade a promise that Tenochtitlan would not kneel. The sun burned brighter that day, but the shadows kept coming. When the battle finally came, it wasn't the clash of two armies. It was the slow choking of something immense, the constriction of a serpent around the throat of an eagle. The Spaniards did not fight like the neighboring tribes. They did not honor the gods of the land, nor did they fear the wrath of Huitzilopochtli. The warriors struck with spears of obsidian, but their blades shattered against Spanish steel. Drums roared through the city, echoing the heartbeat of the empire, but their rhythm faltered beneath the crack of Spanish cannons. The ground itself seemed to shake, not with the power of gods, but with the relentless march of the foreign invaders. Still, the Aztecs fought. Every stone of Tenochtitlan, every narrow canal, every bridge became a battlefield soaked in the blood of those who would not surrender. Huitzilopochtli's name rang out with each warrior's last breath. At the height of the siege, when the flames licked the sky and smoke rolled thick over the city, the temple of Huitzilopochtli stood tall. Warriors fought beneath its shadow, their backs pressed against its ancient stones. It felt as if the god himself watched from the heavens, his gaze locked on the burning heart of the empire. When the end came, it was slow. Walls that had stood for centuries crumbled under cannon fire. The streets ran red as the final warriors fell to the ground, clutching shattered weapons and whispered prayers. The banner of the sun lowered for the first time, its golden threads soaked in mud and ash. The Spaniards marched through the remains of the city, their boots heavy against the stone. The great temple, once alive with the hum of drums and the flicker of fire, now stood silent. The statue of Huitzilopochtli remained where it always had, but something had shifted in its gaze, a question left unanswered, a promise broken. But gods are not forgotten so easily. Though the streets grew quiet and the banners of conquest unfurled, the people remembered. In the hush of night, beneath the watchful stars, offerings still found their way to hidden shrines. A lock of hair, a bundle of maize, the soft murmur of prayers carried on the wind. The fire may have dimmed, but somewhere in the heart of those who survived, it still smoldered. The sun, though obscured by clouds of conquest, was never extinguished. And as long as the people remembered Huitzilopochtli's name, his spirit would wait, resting not in stone, but in the blood that still coursed through the veins of the fallen empire. The sky wept as the city burned. Black smoke rose like ghosts, curling around the temples and bridges that had stood for generations. From the heart of Tenochtitlan, the flames stretched high enough to touch the heavens, as if trying to reach the gods themselves. The streets groaned beneath the weight of bodies, warriors and civilians alike crumpled where they had fallen, their blood mingling with the waters of the canals. The Spaniards pressed forward, step by step, as if dragging the sun from the sky with each advance. The great stone serpent that had once guarded the temple of Huitzilopochtli lay broken, shattered by foreign hands. Yet, in the eyes of those who still fought, the god had not abandoned them. He stood with them in the shadows, behind the smoke, where the light flickered but did not go out. They whispered his name even as their strength faded. Huitzilopochtli, the warrior who had led them to this valley, whose heart burned in the sky each day. The fall of Tenochtitlan could not be separated from him. If the empire fell, then surely the god himself had turned away or been wounded by something beyond understanding. Some believed he had taken the form of an eagle and soared far from the city, circling above the smoke, waiting for the time to strike again. Others thought he had descended beneath the earth, carrying the spirits of the fallen on his back, retreating into the underworld to gather strength. There were those who said Huitzilopochtli had not fallen at all, that he stood in the last temple, unseen by the invaders, a great spear in his hand, daring them to reach him. As the last of the Aztec warriors stood on the broken bridges, their backs to the ruins of the city, the myth began to grow. Huitzilopochtli had not failed them. The world had shifted. The sun god was locked in battle with something far older, something that came not from the mountains or forests, but across the ocean. This was not defeat, they told themselves. It was the moment before rebirth, the gathering of shadows before the dawn. Even as the Spaniards melted the gold from the temples and tore the heart from the city, the stories continued. Huitzilopochtli's heart still beat beneath the ruins, thundering in time with the footsteps of those who survived. The spirit of the sun would never be extinguished by swords and fire. When the rains finally came and washed the blood from the streets, those who walked the shattered remains of Tenochtitlan carried their heads high. They left offerings in hidden places, small figures carved from stone, obsidian blades wrapped in cloth, feathers bright as sunlight. These were not gifts for the Spaniards' god. They belonged to the one who had stood with them, the one who still watched. In the years that followed, when the empire had crumbled into memory and the weight of foreign rule bore down on the people, the stories grew louder. Huitzilopochtli had not been defeated. His absence was temporary, and one day, the sun would rise over the valley in such brilliance that no man or empire could stand against it. Even now, in the quiet corners of Mexico, the echoes remain. In the glint of sunlight on stone, in the call of eagles over the mountains, in the warmth of fire that refuses to die out. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not the end. It was the turning of a page, written not in the language of the conquerors, but in the blood and spirit of a people who would not forget. And so the story carries forward, each telling a reminder that gods do not die when cities fall. They linger, just out of sight, waiting for the moment when the sun burns hot enough to awaken them once more. The ink bled into the pages, thick and dark, as if the words themselves carried the weight of something ancient and restless. Spanish chroniclers wrote by candlelight, their quills scratching across paper that seemed too thin to hold the enormity of what they were trying to capture. They were not just describing a god, they were trying to tame him, reshape him into something their world could grasp. Huitzilopochtli's name lingered in the air like the last notes of a fading drum. For the men who recorded his story, there was unease in writing it down. How could they speak of a god who drank blood from the lips of warriors and danced across the battlefield in feathered armor? How could they make sense of a figure whose heart beat in sync with the sun, whose very breath demanded war and sacrifice? They tried to call him by different names. A demon. A false idol. But the weight of his presence pressed against the edges of their understanding, like shadows stretching beyond the reach of their flickering lanterns. His image could not be erased, no matter how many words they used to bury him beneath layers of judgment and condemnation. In their writings, he shifted and twisted, as if refusing to stay still on the page. Sometimes, he was a savage god, wrapped in serpents and thirsting for blood. Other times, he stood proud and noble, a protector leading his people through danger and darkness. The chroniclers could not agree, and perhaps that was the truest reflection of Huitzilopochtli. He was never just one thing. As the chroniclers filled their books with the stories of conquest and destruction, Huitzilopochtli's figure rose again and again, like smoke curling up from the ruins. They wrote of the great temple that once stood in his honor, how its steps had run red with the blood of sacrifice. They described the rituals, the songs that filled the air, the cries of warriors who believed that to die for him was to live forever. But even as they wrote, there was something in the tone of their words, something unspoken, but felt between the lines. A quiet acknowledgement that this god, this sun-faced warrior, had been more than just stone and ceremony. There was power in the name, something that resisted translation. They saw it in the eyes of the people who survived. Those who walked through the streets of Mexico Tenochtitlan long after its fall still whispered his name, still offered him silent prayers beneath the surface of their new faith. Huitzilopochtli had not vanished with the arrival of the Spanish. He lingered, woven into the very bones of the city, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Some chroniclers softened their words, though they would not admit why. They left room for admiration, slipping small moments of awe into their records. They marveled at the precision of the Aztec warriors, the loyalty of those who fought in his name. In those rare lines, the god's presence flickered once more, not as a relic of the past, but as a quiet, enduring force, etched into the soul of a people who had lost their empire, but not their fire. Even as churches rose atop the ruins, and crosses took the place of stone idols, the chroniclers could not forget him. Their words carried him forward, shaping him in ways they could not predict. Huitzilopochtli did not disappear beneath their pens, he adapted, slipping into the folds of new stories, new beliefs. He became a symbol, sometimes hidden, but always present. And when the chronicler's hands grew still, when the last page was turned and the candle light faded, the silence did not last. Outside, beneath the stars, his name still echoed, softly, like the beating of wings in the dark. The scent of marigolds drifts through the air, curling around flickering candles set carefully along an altar. A quiet hush fills the space, broken only by the soft rustle of papal picado swaying gently in the wind. Faces of loved ones, their black and white photographs adorned with flowers, gaze out from beneath crucifixes. But somewhere, beneath the layers of Catholic prayers and tender remembrances, something older stirs. It hums low and steady, like the distant beat of a war drum just beneath the heart. There's something unspoken that lingers during celebrations like Dia de los Muertos. It's in the way the living honor the dead, not with sorrow, but with vibrant offerings, color, and light. A quiet defiance against the darkness, as if to say that even in death, the spirit still holds power. This defiance feels ancient. Older than the churches. Older than the words that try to explain it. The candles aren't just for remembrance. They guide souls home, lighting the path for those who walk between worlds. It's said that Huitzilopochtli's warriors, the ones who fell in battle, followed the sun in the afterlife. But every so often, their spirits found their way back to the land of the living, carried on the breath of prayers and songs. The marigolds, golden like sunlight, are more than flowers, their footprints marking the way. The past never really left. It simply put on new clothes. When conquistadors raised their crosses, hoping to wash the land clean of old gods, they didn't notice the way the people quietly wove Huitzilopochtli's stories into the seams of their new faith. Statues of saints held the fierce gaze of warriors. The Virgin of Guadalupe, radiant and fierce in her celestial mantle, stood not so far from the image of a goddess who had once birthed a sun god beneath the stars. They say the Virgin appeared on Tepeyac Hill, but long before her, that hill belonged to Tenochtitlan, the mother of the gods. And in her eyes, some whispered, they could still see a reflection of Coatlicue, Huitzilopochtli's mother, wrapped in serpents and stars. During processions, drums echo through the streets, their rhythm unmistakable. They're meant to call to saints, but the beat feels like an ancient heart pounding beneath the cobblestones. The masked dancers that twirl and stomp seem to channel something older than the festivals themselves. Plumes of feathers rise above their heads, and for a fleeting moment, there's a flicker of something fierce, a jaguar's growl, the sharp cry of an eagle. Old warriors never fade. They simply shift shape. In small villages, stories are whispered at night, passed from one generation to the next. Elders speak of men who could call down lightning or summon the wind with a single word. They say that some bloodlines still carry Huitzilopochtli's fire, that his strength runs through those who stand tallest when storms come. And when the harvest sun burns hot and heavy, some still offer a quiet prayer to the sky, asking for the same protection the Aztecs once sought as they marched beneath banners embroidered with his name. Even in the quiet, he lingers. His presence hums beneath cathedrals, buried but never gone. On certain feast days, when incense curls through the rafters and sunlight spills through stained glass, some say they can feel it, the thrum of something powerful pressing against the edges of the ceremony. It's not blasphemy. It's survival. Children play games during festivals, their faces painted like skulls, but sometimes their costumes are more than just skeletons. They wear jaguar masks or don feathered headdresses, tracing the steps of warriors long past. They think they're playing, but in their laughter, something ancient stirs. Huitzilopochtli smiles through their joy, living on in the games of those too young to know his name. During storms, when lightning cracks across the sky, some elders still murmur that it's the sun god's spear striking down enemies beyond sight. The rain that follows feels less like water and more like the tears of fallen warriors returning to the earth. There are no grand monuments left for him, but his memory hides in plain sight, woven into lullabies, stitched into festival banners, and hidden in the folds of prayers meant for saints. Time tries to erase, but some things refuse to be forgotten. Huitzilopochtli's story flickers like a flame, small but stubborn. A god of war, of strength, of sacrifice, but also a god of resilience. And as long as the sun rises each morning, casting its light over mountains and fields, his presence lingers, unbroken. The sun breaks over the mountains, pouring light over the valleys below like molten gold. There's something about the way it rises, unyielding, fierce, that feels familiar, even if no one speaks of it aloud. In the quiet of the morning, when the streets are still empty and shadows cling to the corners, there's an ancient pride that hums beneath the surface. It lives in the soil, in the bricks of the old buildings, and in the veins of the people who walk those streets. Some things don't need words to survive. They root themselves so deeply into the land that time can't touch them. Huitzilopochtli's name might not echo in everyday speech, but he lingers, in the resilience of a nation that has been broken and rebuilt again and again. He watches from behind the faces of those who refuse to bow, who fight for every inch of their place beneath the sun. They say the eagle on the Mexican flag was his doing, a sign sent down to lead his people to Tenochtitlan. The eagle, sharp-eyed and strong, perched atop a cactus with a serpent clenched in its beak, is more than a symbol. It's a reminder that strength comes not from comfort, but from struggle. That greatness doesn't wait for calm waters, but rises, bloodied and relentless, from the heart of chaos. On national holidays, when flags ripple in the wind and voices sing the anthem loud enough to shake the sky, something stirs beneath the surface. It feels like the march of old warriors, their shadows stretching long beneath the sun. Their banners may be gone, but their spirit, unyielding and fierce, marches alongside every parade, wrapped in the hearts of those who carry the weight of history like armor. The resilience of the people, through wars, invasions, revolutions, carries his mark. Huitzilopochtli was not a god of peace. He was the fire that burned away weakness, the force that pressed forward when retreat felt easy. And that same fire, though softened by the passage of time, still burns quietly in the people. It flickers in the eyes of those who stand tall even when the odds are impossible. It burns in every protest, and every voice that rises against injustice, as if somewhere deep within, they know the sun god still watches, still demands strength. Mothers tell stories to their children, not of gods, but of perseverance. Of ancestors who crossed mountains and deserts with nothing but hope clutched to their chests. They speak of grandfathers who built homes with hands calloused from years of work, of grandmothers who held families together with sheer will. The stories may not carry Huitzilopochtli's name, but he's there, and every lesson about standing tall and fighting for what matters. Murals stretch across city walls, bright and bold. Faces of revolutionaries, artists, and heroes stare out from the paint. And behind them, if you look closely enough, there's something older, shadows of eagles, of jaguars, of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder. The art pulses with life, a visual heartbeat that refuses to fade. Even the streets, lined with markets and music, feel like they carry the weight of centuries, as if the stones remember every step that has passed over them. In times of hardship, when the sky seems heavy and hope feels far away, people lift their eyes. They don't know why, but they look to the sun, as if waiting for something, perhaps a sign, perhaps just warmth. But the sun has always been more than light. It's a reminder. Huitzilopochtli was the sun, relentless in his path across the sky. To stop would mean death, and so he never faltered. And neither do the people. Even in death, there is pride. Graves are adorned with flowers, their petals bursting with color against the cold stone. Cemeteries are not places of sorrow, but of remembrance and celebration. The living honor the dead by living well, by carrying their stories forward with heads held high. It's the kind of strength that can't be destroyed, a quiet echo of the God who once led an empire with nothing but willpower and fire. Every now and then, in the quiet moments between celebrations and hardships, someone might stop and feel it, the weight of history, the hum of resilience that runs beneath their skin. They may not have a name for it, but they know it's there. And as long as the sun continues to rise over the mountains, that strength will remain, watching and waiting, just as it always has. A mural stretches across the wall, vast and unrelenting, its colors bleeding into the cracks of the stone as if the earth itself refuses to let the story fade. The god stares out from the center, his eyes fierce, his skin painted in the bold blues of war and the golden hues of the sun. There is something unsettling in his gaze, not cruel, but unwavering, the kind of stare that burns into the back of your mind long after you've looked away. The brush strokes are jagged, deliberate, like the artist's hand trembled with the weight of the story being told. Every inch of the mural thrums with movement. Warriors raise their macua hoodles, jaguars prowl at their feet, and above them, the eagle soars. It isn't frozen in time. It feels alive, as though the figures might step from the wall at any moment, weapons glinting beneath the midday sun. Passers-by slow their steps. Children pause to stare, their small hands tracing the edges of the god's headdress, their eyes wide with something between awe and fear. The old ones nod quietly, recognizing an echo of something they've always known but never spoken aloud. The mural doesn't need words. It pulses with a heartbeat older than memory. In the quiet corners of libraries, tucked away beneath dust-covered shelves, the god lives in ink and paper. His name hums through ancient codices, painted with the same reverence as the stars and the mountains. The writers don't shy away from the violence. Huitzilopochtli does not wear the gentle mask of gods born from soft rain or bountiful harvests. His story is jagged, fierce, raw. It spills from the pages in sharp bursts, the hum of marching warriors, the cry of sacrifice, the flare of the sun overhead as another battle begins. But even in those harsh strokes, there is beauty. The kind of beauty that lingers not in perfection, but in survival. The stories tell of his birth, not from the earth or the sky, but from fire and fury, emerging fully armed to protect his people before he had even drawn his first breath. It's not the tale of a gentle savior. It's the story of resilience, of standing in the face of the impossible and refusing to yield. The artists of today do not forget him. On the streets, in hidden alleys, his image appears like a whisper that refuses to die. In one corner, he stands atop a serpent, his spear pointed to the sky. In another, his face merges with the rising sun, half-shadowed but unmistakable. Some paintings stretch across entire buildings, swallowing brick and concrete with the weight of old stories demanding to be remembered. Others are small, tucked beneath bridges or drawn onto crumbling walls, delicate but unbreakable. The stories aren't confined to the walls. Writers continue to call him back into existence with every word penned, letting his name bleed through the pages of historical fiction and poetry. They write him not as a relic of the past, but as a constant, a reminder that his spirit has never left. In these retellings, he stands tall beside revolutionaries and rebels, his shadow long over fields of fallen soldiers. Some say the god walks alongside those who fight, his spear raised high in the hands of those who refuse to stay silent. The stories blend and twist until the line between myth and reality blurs. The battles fought centuries ago begin to feel like mirrors to the struggles of today. In the chants of protests and the fists raised high against injustice, there's an echo of the old songs once sung beneath the sun god's banner. Even the smallest carvings, the tiniest symbols scratched into stone or painted onto pottery, seem to hum with his presence. The weight of his name doesn't fade with time. It lingers in the colors of the murals, the strokes of the brush, the press of ink against paper. He does not ask for worship. He demands remembrance, not as a god of the distant past, but as a part of the beating heart that carries forward with every step the people take. And when the sun rises, cutting across the rooftops and spilling down onto the streets, it feels like he's watching. Always watching. The sun hangs low over the stone temples, casting long shadows that stretch across the plaza. There is something ancient in the air, something that hums beneath the surface of the stones beneath your feet. A vendor adjusts his display, carefully laying out small clay replicas of warriors with feathered headdresses, their faces fierce, their hands clutching miniature macuahoodles. The tourists pass by slowly, their footsteps hesitant, as if the weight of the place urges quiet. In the corner, a child pulls at his mother's hand, pointing toward a towering statue of Huitzilopochtli, his gaze fixed high above the square. The god's figure looms overhead, not threatening, but commanding, his spear pointed toward the heavens as if still guarding the city from unseen dangers. The mother kneels beside the boy, whispering a story handed down through generations, one she heard herself at his age. The child listens, wide-eyed, the toy in his hand forgotten. There's a pulse here, something alive beneath the surface. It's in the way the musicians gather at the temple steps, their drums echoing through the square like heartbeats from another time. The air smells faintly of incense, drifting from small altars set up along the streets, offerings of marigolds and candles flickering in the afternoon breeze. Not far away, a guide leads a group of visitors up the steep steps of a reconstructed pyramid. He pauses at the top, letting them catch their breath before speaking. His voice carries a weight that pulls everyone closer, as if the god himself listens from the shadows of the temple. He tells them of a time when warriors climbed these same steps, not with cameras slung around their necks, but with the weight of duty on their shoulders. Sacrifices were made here, he says, not in cruelty, but in reverence, each drop of blood an offering to ensure the sun would rise again. The tourists stand in silence, the city sprawling beneath them, and for a moment, the line between past and present feels paper-thin. A hawk circles overhead, wings slicing through the sky like an echo of the eagle standard once carried into battle. The guide doesn't mention it, but some notice and whisper quietly among themselves. In the markets below, artisans carve Huitzilopochtli's face into obsidian, each etch of the blade careful and deliberate. His image appears on jewelry, painted across canvas, and pressed into silver medallions. A woman purchases a small pendant, running her thumb over the edges. She doesn't know why, but she feels compelled to keep it close. The streets beyond are lined with murals, their colors so vivid it feels as though the figures might step down from the walls. In one, Huitzilopochtli's eyes burn bright as flames, his spear raised high over a crowd of warriors, their faces turned skyward. In another, he stands tall beside the Virgin of Guadalupe, their figures side by side, as if woven into the same story by the hands of time. Tour buses wait just outside the square, but few people are in a hurry to leave. The air feels heavier here, as though parting from the temple means leaving behind something far older than the city itself. Even those who arrive skeptical leave with a quiet reverence, unsure of what they've felt but certain it was real. At night, the streets flicker with the light of festival lanterns, their glow illuminating dancers dressed in feathered headdresses that shimmer like the sun. Drums thunder, and the square becomes a stage, each movement a reflection of rituals performed for centuries. Children sit on their fathers' shoulders, watching as the dancers step in time to a rhythm passed down through blood and bone. The god isn't gone. His image burns in the firelight, carried on the backs of those who refuse to let him fade. His presence lingers in every step, every beat of the drum, every flicker of the flame. And when the festival ends, when the vendors pack their wares and the music fades into the cool night air, he remains, waiting in the stone, the murals, and the stories whispered in the dark. The sky wasn't always certain to light. That was the fear etched into the bones of the Aztec people, a fear passed down from stories older than the stones beneath their feet. The sun hung above them by threads worn thin, and if those threads snapped, the world would collapse into darkness. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even the bravest found themselves uneasy, hearts turned toward Huitzilopochtli. It was his spear that split apart the night, dragging the sun into the sky. But nothing came freely. Every ray of light was one with blood and breath, with sacrifices whispered to the heavens. People stood on the temple steps with faces turned upward, the first glow of morning spilling across their skin like a gift wrapped in fire. There was gratitude, but also understanding. The gods gave, but they took just as easily. This was the way of things, and it made each sunrise sacred. It's easy now to dismiss these beliefs, to push them aside as relics of a distant past. But there's something uncomfortable in that dismissal, a quiet recognition that lingers beneath modern life. The thought slips through cracks in the night: what if the Aztecs weren't entirely wrong? Not about gods perched in the sky with hearts of obsidian, but about the weight that comes with creation. The belief that nothing worth having arrives without cost. That the greatest lights are born from struggle, from offering up pieces of yourself and standing in the face of collapse. People now trade blood sacrifices for long hours beneath flickering screens, chasing success with shadows under their eyes and tired hands. The battlefield looks different, but the war feels the same. And when those battles are won, when the sun breaks over the horizon of a long-fought goal, it carries a warmth that feels ancient, something primal. The Aztecs fought for their gods because they believed the gods fought for them. There was no line between myth and life. Huitzilopochtli wasn't just a distant figure looming above the temples. He was woven into the pulse of their existence, his victories reflected in their survival. Every harvest, every conquest, every newborn child was proof that he had not abandoned them. In a world that often feels cold and indifferent, there's a strange comfort in the thought of gods who bleed beside you, who share in your burdens. The Aztecs knew loss intimately, but they also believed that through sacrifice, something greater could rise. That belief lingers in places most don't recognize. It's in the way people gather to rebuild after disaster, their hands calloused and hearts heavy, driven by hope that flickers faint but refuses to die. It's in the quiet sacrifices made for family, the unspoken understanding that love often asks for more than words. Huitzilopochtli's lessons weren't soft. They were hard-edged, carved into stone, and carried by warriors whose lives were measured by the weight of their shields. But beneath the harshness lay something tender, a belief in renewal, and the power of giving even when nothing is certain. Modern life rarely calls for warriors with spears, but it demands resilience all the same. People may no longer stand beneath temple steps, but they stand before new altars, hospital beds, courtrooms, classrooms, offering what they can, hoping it's enough to keep the light from flickering out. And perhaps that's the quiet thread tying the present to the past. The sacrifices have changed, but the need for them hasn't. Huitzilopochtli's voice may have faded from the wind, but his lessons echo in the persistence of those who refuse to let darkness win. There's no grand altar now, but people still gather in his honor, whether they realize it or not. His face peers from murals painted on city walls, his story whispered in songs that drift through the streets. And as long as the sun rises, as long as people fight for the light, he remains. The fire never really went out. Even when Tenochtitlan crumbled and the echoes of battle slipped into silence, the embers of Huitzilopochtli's flame smoldered beneath the surface. Smoke still lingered in the breath of those who refused to forget, those who walked the ruins and felt the weight of every stone left standing. Some say the sun was heavier after that, like it dragged itself across the sky with less urgency, mourning a city that once bled in its honor. But the Aztec heart beats differently. It knows that the sun does not rise out of mercy. It rises because the world demands it. Because no matter how many times the night tries to swallow it whole, the sun will claw its way back, spear first, burning through the dark like a warrior refusing to fall. In the eyes of the old, you can still see it, how they look at the horizon when the sky cracks open with morning light. There's reverence there, as if they know something the rest have forgotten. As if, for just a moment, they hear the footsteps of warriors marching alongside the dawn. The New World tried to sweep Huitzilopochtli into myth, bury him beneath cathedrals, and crown foreign saints in his place. But gods tied to the sun are hard to kill. He lingers in murals splashed across the streets of Mexico City, in the festivals that set the night on fire, in the heartbeat of every person who fights to keep moving forward. Somewhere, a child hears his name for the first time, and it doesn't sound like history. It feels like something alive, something still watching from the shadows of the mountains. A God who waits, not for temples to rise again, but for people to remember that strength is built in the spaces between suffering and sacrifice. Those who walk in his light know this: life is not handed to the living. It is taken with both hands, dragged from the jaws of doubt and fear. The path forward isn't paved in certainty. It is a battlefield, and the sun waits for those brave enough to fight for it. There's something fierce in that thought, something that makes the blood feel hot in the veins. It burns with the same fire that lit the steps of the Templo Mayor, the same fire that sent warriors running headlong into battles they knew they might not survive. And even now, the flame is passed between hands in ways that don't always look like war. It's in a mother who carries more than her share so her children can rest. It's in the stranger who stands tall when others kneel. It's in the voice that breaks through silence, demanding the world listen. Huitzilopochtli was never just a god of war. He was the promise that the fight could be won. When dust bleeds into the horizon, shadows stretch long across the land, and there's a stillness that presses down. Some see it as an ending. But those who know better understand, it's only the pause before the flame rises again. The sun always comes back. The question is, who will stand ready to greet it?